hear it, but good evening, members. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the public. This is a special session of the P&I for the delivery of two presentations. Before I start the formalities of the evening, I'd just like to mention, and this is directed at Councillor Mrs. James. Councillor Mrs. James, last night I think we had a slight miscommunication. I probably said some things that didn't come out right, and for that, if there was any misunderstanding on your part and my part, I am sincerely sorry that we had that misinterpretation last evening.
I thank you for your apology. Thank you.
Right. As we have members of the public, we'll go through the agenda for the evening. First of all, fire evacuation procedures. In the event of a fire, we're not expecting any practices this evening. The fire exits are located on the main door that you came into this evening and to the rear of the top table here. If you would quietly, orderly walk out of the building and rendezvous in the Memorial Park, and please don't go away because we will take a head count out there. I would ask that all mobile phones are either switched to silent or off, please. The meeting is being webcast. Thank you. Any apologies for absence?
Councillor Watts will be late.
Thank you. And I note Councillor Mrs. Cubitt is not here. She is? Okay. Any resignations and replacements? Councillor Short. Thank you very much. Declarations of conflict of interest. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have a disclosable pecuniary interest in anything, but I do have a personal interest in a number of sites in the local plan, and I've simply made that a public statement. It's on my register of interests.
Thank you for that. There are no urgent items, and we are confirming some minutes tonight? I didn't think so. This will be, the minutes of the 26th of June will be confirmed on the 12th of September. Members and public participation about issues contained within the agenda. The way we're running this one tonight is that we're going to have two presentations. The first one is on the affordable housing viability update from Three Dragons this evening. The way we're going to work it is that the presentation will be delivered, then I'll be inviting members to ask questions of the presenter. I will also include the opportunity for those members sitting in the audience to come forward and ask questions. We're not planning to have public participation this evening. These are delivery, both the presentations are a method of delivery of evidence to the council. It's the deliverable occasion. This is the occasion of the delivery of that evidence. Standing invitations to the portfolio holder who is present. Referrals from other committees of the council, nothing. Issues referred by cabinet, nothing tonight. We then move on to affordable housing viability update on paper A, and officers to present, please.
Thank you, Chair. Members will be aware that in considering the emerging plan over the past couple of meetings, discussions have yet to take place in respect of the affordable housing policy, which has been pending further work in respect of viability. This evening you'll receive a short presentation from Dominic Houston from Three Dragons, who's been looking into the viability of the draft policies for us, particularly in respect of affordable housing, and the need to take this into account when preparing a future community infrastructure levy. Dominic will explain how they've tested a number of development scenarios to replicate the type of development that we expect to get in the borough through the local plan. The outcomes of this work will provide guidance on what levels of affordable housing should be required in plan policy based on the need to collect a sill charge in the future. Finally, just to say that a draft of the affordable housing policy was circulated to members last night, and it's intended that the committee will consider the policy in more detail at tomorrow night's meeting, alongside the policy in respect of rural exceptions for affordable housing. So on that note, I'll pass over to Dominic.
Good evening, all of you. My name is Dominic Hoos from Three Dragons, and as Councillor Miller and Mark Lambert have said, I'll be providing a presentation on the work we've undertaken on development viability. Just very briefly, a short bit of background into the company I work for and who I am. Three Dragons was established in 1996. I've been with Three Dragons for about a year doing development viability work, and prior to that I worked for Roger Tim and Partners, also doing development viability work. Three Dragons are specialists in research relating to housing delivery and housing policy, and also developed and operate the nationally used financial viability model called the Three Dragons Toolkit. And the company's done viability studies, both affordable housing and community infrastructure levy viability, for 16 authorities over the last 3 years. This study is a viability assessment to support the development of the local plan, and also in setting a community infrastructure levy. At the outset, the brief did not include affordable housing. That was added in sort of partway through the process. And so our objectives in terms of undertaking the research are to test what proportion and tenure of affordable housing is viable in the borough, how this might differ in different value areas, different locations within Basingstoke and Deane, and the implications for the amount of CIL that development may be obliged to pay. The work we're doing also includes non-residential development viability as well, in respect of community infrastructure levy, but I'm not going to be talking about that this evening. The work we're undertaking is partway through. We're due to complete our work in August of this year. The information that we've based our work on is drawn from a variety of sources, and it's probably useful that you have some kind of insight into what they are. So you'll see a number of sources on there which are publicly available and recognised sources. Importantly, they're sources that the examination process will recognise as well. Within that, you'll see reference with, to discussion with council officers, and we've worked very closely with the borough council officers and also with county council in undertaking this work. And we've also, after having done a set of desk research, we've tested our findings with the development industry through the use of a development industry workshop about 2 weeks ago, which was well attended, lively and informative. And so, if you like, what I'm demonstrating to you here really is a process of using recognised official sources tested with the developers who are active within the borough. And that's provided the foundation for the information we've then used in order to model viability. The work we've done is within the guidance, such as it exists. There's some bits of it that I would like to draw your attention to, really. Within the MPPF, there's the aspect that the local plan meets the full, objectively assessed needs for market and affordable housing, which is to say that we recognise that housing delivery is an important component of what you have to plan for, and we've taken account of that within our modelling and also within our interpretation of the results. The second quote in there is where we make very explicit note of the fact that once the costs of development are taken into account and the costs of meeting obligations within planning obligations and standards, that there is a sufficient financial return for the development industry and for landowners to bring development forward, i.e. that the MPPF explicitly notes and recognises that there needs to be a profit within this process for it to happen. And then lastly, that our assessment has to assess the cumulative impact of all the plan policies that may have an impact on development viability, and that needs to be within the modelling that we do. I've also referred here to community infrastructure levy guidance as well. I've been asked just to give a very brief rehearsal of what community infrastructure levy is at this stage. Community infrastructure levy is in large part is a replacement for Section 106 and 278, insofar as it is a mechanism for using value from the development process, planning obligations, in order to fund infrastructure. So that's education, transport, green space, art, and so on. And it's the process that the government is keen that local authorities move over to, rather than, as is the current situation, using Section 106 obligations. And the government has created a set of regulations which will make it more difficult for the council to continue to use Section 106 in the future, in order to encourage Basingstoke and Deane, as with all other councils, to use community infrastructure levy. Now, the reason that community infrastructure levy is important in a discussion about affordable housing is that the money, or if you like, the value that affordable housing uses to be delivered is also the same pot that the community infrastructure levy uses as well. So the decisions that are taken about the proportion and tenure of affordable housing will also have implications for the amount of CIL that the borough is able to charge development as its replacement for Section 106 later on down the line. So within the presentation that I'm doing this evening, I've tried to sort of illustrate that relationship, and in order to provide some kind of basis. Now, it's been made quite clear to me that tonight and this immediate part of the process tomorrow is not about setting a rate for the community infrastructure levy. That happens later on down the line. I believe it's in September. But nonetheless, it's important in deciding what the council's housing policy would be, that community infrastructure levy is taken into account. There is also a procedural link between community infrastructure levy and the local plan as well, insofar as a local plan uses or relies upon the infrastructure delivery plan. The infrastructure delivery plan will have a funding strategy that will include CIL, and in order to for that process to work, you then have to ensure that the CIL process is robust, in order that the IDP is robust, in order that it is able to sufficiently support the local plan and demonstrate delivery. This slide here sort of very briefly provides an overview of the process we use for viability testing. It's a residual value model, which is a standard model used for both specific sites and area-wide viability testing. The way it works is that the assessment estimates the total development value, so if you like, the sum of the values that might come out of a housing scheme. It takes off what the costs of delivering that will be, so that will be the build costs, that will be the associated professional fees, that will include a return to the developer as well for doing it, and that leaves a gross residual value. From that is deducted community infrastructure levy, planning obligations, and including affordable housing, and that will leave a net residual value, and that is the amount of money that is left available to pay for the land. Now that amount is then compared to the benchmark land value, which is the value that a landowner might be judged sufficient to sell the land, to see whether the development is viable or not, i.e. whether the net residual value is above the land benchmark, in which case it's viable, or below, in which case it's not. And the graph on the left attempts to illustrate that, really, where on the vertical axis you've got the residual land value. On the horizontal axis you've got the sort of the notional value of the affordable housing and CIL obligations, and as those obligations increase, the residual value will go down from any given development, and if it goes down too far, the value from the development will be below the threshold. So if you like, in lots of ways it's not a complex process, but in some respects it is counterintuitive, in that you don't start with the price of the land. The price of the land is what you consider after you've worked out the other aspects of the development. But I emphasise again, this is the standard and recognised way of doing development viability assessments. As part of the plan, as part of the work, we've looked at the local plan policies and their impact on development viability. Generally speaking, and I'm sure it would be so in this case, the policy that has the single greatest impact on development viability is that to do with affordable housing. Now, clearly that hasn't been set yet for the borough. So what we've done is we've undertaken modelling, development viability modelling, at different proportions of affordable housing in order to see what kind of viability comes out of it. Now, within the affordable housing, there's a mix of rented accommodation, which is about 2/3 of the affordable housing, and shared ownership, which is about 1/3. Within the rented proportion, we've also flexed the testing in order to see what the impact of having predominantly social renting as opposed to predominantly affordable renting is. So these are two different rental levels that are used for affordable housing, and they do have an impact on viability. We've also made allowance for the sustainable water policy, which I think is EM12, where there's a requirement that development is at a standard to deliver code for sustainable homes for water, and that has a financial implication. We've allowed a residual Section 106 and 278 allowance of £1,500 per dwelling. It's probably important I tell you now that the current Section 106 and 278 sort of burden, if you like, on development is on average about £7,200 per dwelling. So what we've done is we've recognised that the take will be lower in the future because of the pressure you'll be under to reduce the amount you take in 106 and to move over to SIL. We haven't included provision for lifetime homes and space standards because although there's been discussion about these, there are no specific policies, as I understand it at the moment, within the local plan. And very importantly, the modelling assumes that SIL, Community Infrastructure Levy, will be used to pay for all strategic infrastructure. So that's transport, education, strategic green space, and so on. Now that's quite important because the viability modelling would look very different if that assumption were different. But what that also means is that because SIL is being assumed to pay for these items, that the provisions you make for affordable housing allow you to collect enough SIL in order to make that true. The modelling recognises that there are different value areas within Basingstoke and Deane. We started off actually with a very complex mosaic of different values. The information source we use to get the values is land registry data, which provides the price that's actually paid for houses rather than what's asked for them, and we're able to extract the data for new build houses rather than all houses. Through a process of discussion, both sort of within internally and also with the development industry, we've sort of simplified this to two basic market value areas, where there's a Basingstoke and also Tadley as one area, and the rest of the borough as a higher value area. So the blue shaded area there is of higher value. It's worthwhile saying that the boundaries of where this lie are still in development, and it's almost certain that Old Basing will be in the blue area rather than the red area because the values are higher there than in the rest of Basingstoke. Our testing uses two types of site testing. We use some notional 1 hectare tiles. So if you like, these are hypothetical 1 hectare tiles of development where we model different densities of development, we model different dwelling mixes, we model different market areas and different affordable housing proportions and types. And we then use that as clues to undertake some modelling of the actual types of development which are more likely to come forward in the borough. And we've developed a set of case studies in discussion with the officers, and those case studies are representative of the types of development that the local plan is making provision for. Both the 1 hectare tile and also the case studies are tested against threshold land values, and you'll recollect I explained how they fitted in as part of the process earlier on. There are two land value benchmarks that we are using in broad terms. For greenfield strategic sites, so this would be the large scale urban extensions on Basingstoke, so for example Manydown, for example, would clearly be part of that, is tested against a threshold land value of £400,000 per gross hectare. And it's important to say that these figures have been looked at from a number of angles and discussed with the development industry as well. Within Basingstoke and for smaller sites elsewhere, we've tested against a benchmark of £1 million per hectare, which is at the lower end of what's reported, but also fits with a sort of an uplift on existing use values as well. We are aware that some land has transacted at higher values than that benchmark, and so we've also got, if you like, a secondary benchmark of £1.3 million per hectare, which recognises that some landowners will have aspirations for more value for their land, and that there have been recent transactions which would support the fact that sometimes land does change hands at these higher values as well. So we've included that within the testing. Now, I'm hoping that will... Okay. This slide here has got quite a lot of information on it, so I'll take you through it. This represents two 1 hectare tile tests. It's Basingstoke urban area, which is a 45 dwellings per hectare scheme, and an edge of Basingstoke set of developments which are at 35 dwellings per hectare. And it's probably worthwhile saying that the edge of Basingstoke tile is that which is most representative in locational terms of a loss of the development that I think is being planned for. This graph also maps the difference between social rent and affordable rent. You'll see a vertical black dotted line running through the middle of the graph. To the left of that is predominantly social rent as the main rental component of affordable housing, and to the right affordable rent as the main rental component. Along the bottom axis are different proportions of affordable housing, and from left to right the proportion of affordable housing increases. So if you look at the far left hand bar there, you've got 20% affordable housing, and then it goes to 25, 30, 35 and 40% affordable housing. And you can see that as the proportion of affordable housing increases, the residual value of the development will decrease. There are two coloured lines, horizontal lines on that graph. There's a green one which is set at the £1 million per hectare mark, and that's the main threshold land value that this development is being tested against. And you'll see then the orange line or yellowy line above that, which is at £1.3 million, which is, if you like, the more aspirational land value threshold. Now, the messages I get from looking at that graph are that the urban scheme of slightly higher density and the edge of Basingstoke schemes actually have very little difference in value between them, that the scheme value drops as the percentage of affordable housing increases, and that affordable rent produces better values than social rent. I suppose to add to that is to say that at 40% affordable housing, with social rent lead, there is not enough viability for that development to proceed. And even with affordable rent leading, it is very, very marginal, very, very tight. As you move towards 35% affordable housing, viability improves, there's not that much in it, 30%, and it begins to look far more comfortably viable with some headroom that you might use to draw a sill charge from. This graph here does the same for villages and market towns. Really, the difference between villages and market towns here is that the scheme which is labelled villages is at quite a low density, 20 dwellings per hectare, and the market towns is at 30 dwellings per hectare. There's a similar pattern that as the proportion of affordable housing increases, then the value of the schemes goes down. However, because there are higher values in rural areas and in the market towns, the overall viability picture is much stronger. And certainly one would say that for the higher density scheme, which is still low in absolute, and sorry, in relative terms compared to an urban area, that 40% affordable housing is viable, even with social rent leading as the main rental component. Although there are better values for affordable rent. So between the two, there's sort of quite a different picture really, where outside Basingstoke, viability is strong, and that the current affordable housing target would seem to be deliverable, whereas inside Basingstoke and on the edge of Basingstoke, less so. I've got a set of tables here which sort of take out some of the numbers from those graphs in order to sort of enable you, I hope, to see different aspects of them, and also to begin to see how this might relate to a potential community infrastructure levy charge in the future. So here we have the urban 1 hectare tile. So this is 45 dwellings per hectare, 75% affordable rent, 25% social rent within the rented component. Down the left-hand column, you can see the changing proportions of affordable housing from 20 to 4 down to 40. The next column has the net residual value per hectare, which is the value that then gets compared to the threshold land value. You'll then see the 1.3 million upper benchmark, the main benchmark at 1 million, and then you can see what that might mean in terms of the space available to set a sill. Now again, I emphasise today's process, in my mind at least, is not about setting a sill charge or even getting anywhere near it, but thinking about what level of sill charge you might want to allow within your affordable housing setting process. It's also, I'd like to remind you that the sill guidance says that one shouldn't set a sill charge at the margins of economic viability, and that one would want to allow, for want of a better word, quite a substantial buffer. There is no guidance about what a buffer should be, although there has been discussion at sill examination about buffers of 30%, which isn't necessarily exactly how it should be, but those are the sorts of things that have been discussed. So what you can see there, and this is, I'm looking at the far right-hand column, at 40% affordable housing, even with affordable rent, which is the more viable of the two affordable housing rental options, there is basically no value in there to have any kind of sill. Nominally there's £25, but actually within any kind of margin for error, that could easily be minus 25. At 35%, £74. Again, if you were to leave a sort of 30% margin for error, that would leave you almost no sill. By the time you get to 30% affordable housing, it looks to me as if there is room to set some kind of sill charge in order to pay for the infrastructure that the local plan requires in order to support the development within the borough. And if you were being prudent, you might say you would need to go to 25% for affordable housing in order to have either a higher sill charge or more room for error. But clearly that's a decision for you to take. This is the same sets of figures, but for the edge of Basingstoke scheme. As you will have seen from the graph, there isn't that much difference in the viability between them, and as a result these figures don't differ that much either. So there's not that much difference in terms of 40% affordable housing, where there's really nothing in there for sill. 35% development is arguably viable at the lower benchmark, although some landowners again would say actually that's not enough money, we won't release the land at that level. And by the time you get to 30%, yes, there does seem to be some room within the viability to say, yes, this will work in its own right and with the possibility of some sill. Villages and market towns, same sets of figures again. There are none shaded in red, there's no negatives here. What you will see, reading off the bottom right-hand cell there, potentially a sill of up to £234. So there's lots of room there for still at 40% affordable housing with social renting. The lower density scheme, as we discussed earlier on, is less viable. In some senses, I'm less worried in viability terms about this, because arguably if lower density schemes per se are less viable in rural areas, developers would just build to a higher density in order to get the value. And I think there are also some very low density schemes which will be able to generate higher than average values, and they would be higher than the values that we've modelled at. So I think there will still be some low density rural schemes that actually are quite happily viable. So the implications that I take from looking at those sort of 1 hectare tiles are that within Basingstoke, 40% affordable housing is not viable or marginally viable with affordable rent. 35% affordable housing is just viable. 30% affordable housing is viable with some headroom that one might use for a sill charge. Villages and market towns, the message is, I believe, that 40% affordable housing is generally viable even with 75% social rent within the rental component. So what we then do is to say, okay, these are these sort of slightly artificial 1 hectare tiles. How do they relate to the case studies? Now, because we're only partway through our work, we haven't modelled all of the case studies yet. And what we've done is we've modelled one small site in 3 different locations. We've modelled an extension to Overton and Whitchurch of 100 dwellings, and we've looked at 2 urban extensions for Basingstoke, so 400 dwellings and 3,000 dwellings. The full range of case studies will be worked up in full in due course. So these are sort of variations on the same sorts of tables that you saw before. You can see though that because they've got slightly different schemes, they've got different locations down the left-hand side. Second column looks at different densities as well, and this is sort of trying to pick up on the sorts of things that may be developed. Third column is the proportion of affordable housing. So because we've already, well, not necessarily established, but there are strong clues that 30% affordable housing is a suitable level to test Basingstoke schemes at. We've used that for the Basingstoke schemes, and 40% for Overton and Whitchurch for this 3 dwelling case study. And you can see that in terms of a potential sill, that a small site in Basingstoke at a 40 dph looks as if it would be able to make some kind of sill payment, and an Overton and Whitchurch small dwelling would small site would also be able to make some kind of sill payment as well at 40%. The Basingstoke Edge lower density scheme, as with some of the other low density schemes, isn't producing good value, but again I would argue I'm not necessarily that worried about that, because developers wouldn't build it if a higher density scheme in the same location would provide more value for them. Overton and Whitchurch is modelled with 20 dph, 20 dwellings per hectare, 40% affordable, and you can see there we've modelled 75% social rented, and then also to see what the impact of modelling 25% social rented. And you can see that even at the 40%, if you read across to the right-hand column, potentially, even with some room for error in there, there's room for some sill payment in that. So again, that's sort of confirming the view that in the sort of rural areas and market towns, there's enough viability to stick with a higher target for affordable housing. This table here is looking at the medium urban extension, so 400 dwellings on the edge of Basingstoke at 30 dwellings per hectare. It's important to say that it's at this size of development where we start to use the lower benchmark land value of 400,000. Associated with that, we also model extra costs which are related to opening up larger sites as well. So whilst the land value may go down, the development will cost more, so which to a certain extent counterbalances that. That's modelled at 30% and 35% affordable housing, and within that it's flexed about the different affordable and social rented as well. But what that seems to demonstrate is that the scheme's viable at 35% affordable, but with limited room for SIL, particularly if one's pressing for social rent. And the scheme is more viable at 30% with room for SIL and some social rent as well. The strategic urban extension, much bigger, 3,000 dwellings, again at an average density of 30 dwellings per hectare. I should say that's a net hectare as well, because I'm aware that the proposals for the largest urban extension will include a country park as well. So the area for that, for example, isn't included within the density that we're talking about here. Again, this uses the lower land value benchmark. It's modelled at 30% and 35% affordable housing. The scheme is viable at 35% affordable housing, but with very limited room for SIL, and is more viable at 30% affordable housing, and has room for SIL in there as well. The values on this particular scheme, as they are presented to you in this table, are slightly higher than I think they're going to be. There's one aspect of modelling that we've not yet had time to do, which is to time discount some of the costs which are associated with the early part of opening up a large site, for which revenues don't come in until later on. So there are finance charges relating to that which aren't yet within this modelling. So the figures you see there will come down a little bit as well. So the sort of implications that I would take from that is that the case study work that's undertaken so far is confirming the 1 hectare tile findings, really, that within Basingstoke and its urban extensions, 30% affordable housing is viable with some viability headroom for SIL, particularly when used in association with affordable rent predominantly rather than social rent, and that higher proportions of affordable housing are at the borders of viability without any opportunity for SIL. However, within the market towns, 40% affordable housing is generally viable even with social rent. And again, all of this is predicated upon using SIL to deliver the infrastructure. If the development has to directly provide the infrastructure, then the requirement for SIL will decrease, but also the cost of development will increase. So that ends what I have to say at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Educational is what I would say. Now, question for the officers. Do we have a copy of this presentation? To send it out? Yeah, okay. All council members, I think, would like that. Otherwise, we're just working off the only notes we've got tonight. And Dominic, I approached you earlier. Are you prepared to take some questions from council members?
I'll be very pleased to take questions.
Right. The way I'm going to work it, we've got a time limit tonight with the consultants. This will finish at 8 o'clock sharp, because we have more consultants coming to give us another presentation. We've got the members of the committee, and we've got some members in the audience. Do any members of visiting members have any questions of Dominic this evening? No, thank you. I will go around the table in that case and to each of the members of the committee and see if we've got some questions. Councillor Shaw.
Yes, thank you, Chair. A couple of questions, really. You referred to the sort of information sources that were taken into account in terms of the process that you've gone through. And one of those information sources was the Development Industry Workshop. be grateful if you can sort of summarize, what information was provided by developers and what the impact of that was on the calculations. And also, I was just curious about where, well, two things really. One was, because obviously, you're using a particular methodology that's been developed by your company, and it would be helpful to understand how that methodology compares with those used by, other companies in the same field, and if there are any variations in terms of the outcomes of the different methodologies used. And my third question really is how you take into account the potential for any conflicts of interest in your work and how those are managed.
Thank you. Yes, okay, the developer workshop. Firstly, to say that the developer workshop was noted, and that the full notes of that workshop will be available as an appendix to the report. If you like, it provides part of the evidence trail that underpins the work. And that these notes have also been circulated to the people present at the workshop as well, in order that if they disagree with our interpretation of what they said, they have the opportunity to do that. And by implication, if they don't, then they agree with it. I'll very briefly explain who attended. Sentinel Housing Association, Astor Homes, the Homes and Communities Agency, Sovereign, David Wilson Homes, Bewley Homes, T.A. Fisher, Wolf Bond Planning, DGG Planning, the Planning Bureau, who operate on behalf of McCarthy and Stone and Churchill, Savills, Boyer Planning, Jeffrey White, Simmons and Sons, the County Council, the officers from the Borough Council, and ourselves. The way that the workshop operated was that my colleague Lynn Cousins. Thank you. Yeah. That would be, yes. I know it's first laugh I've had tonight, so thank you. Yes. My colleague Lynn Cousins and I presented the detailed inputs to the modelling. Now, by that I mean we presented the actual figures to do with our understanding of the values of different sorts of new build dwellings in different parts of the borough. We presented the cost assumptions, which we drew from the Building Cost Information Service. We explained the allowances we were making for acquisition costs, for legal fees, for marketing, for professional fees, for stamp duty, and so on. So if you like, we took the industry through the detailed numbers for that, and we also took them through the threshold land values as well. And we also talked about affordable housing as well, and the rental levels for affordable housing. We talked about dwelling mixes for different developments as well, because dwelling mixes do have an impact on viability. We talked about dwelling mixes for affordable housing as well as market housing, and we talked about size of development as well, i.e. the average square meterage of houses of different numbers of bedrooms and flats and so on. And through that process, the development industry agreed with some of our assumptions and disagreed and suggested other assumptions. From time to time, they would disagree with themselves, and there was quite a lively dynamic as Lynn and I and the council officers became spectators to a very interesting discussion about different values, and there were some quite strongly held views within that group. maybe one of the things I should have said actually, within the list of people who were attending, you'll have spotted people like David Wilson, who are volume house builders. You'll also have spotted Bewley Homes, who tend to build much smaller developments, and I've already said about Planning Bureau representing McCarthy and Stone and Churchill as well. So if you like, there are people there who are actually delivering the things on the ground. So sort of through that process, there was a number of comments were made, some of which were straightforward recommendations that we amend some of the assumptions that we'd put forward, which we've done. And there were also some suggestions that there were further things that we needed to look at. So, for example, there was a number of views around the table that suggested that since we'd extracted the data from Land Registry, which ran until about November last year, that there had been a change in values within Basingstoke-on-Deane and in other parts of Hampshire as well, for that matter. And so one of the things we were tasked to do was to go and have a look at the data again to see whether in fact values had changed. As it turned out, from Land Registry data, there is as yet no clue that values have changed. But if you like, so they set us a number of things to do, which we've done. We also talked about some issues to do with the amount of developer return that were on sort of affordable housing schemes as well, and we've sort of followed those up as well. And we've got sort of within the notes and within our reporting a sort of a record of the queries that were raised and our response to them, if you like. So that was the developer workshop. Yep, sorry, I'll go more quickly. Yep. How the method compares with others. The basic residual valuation model is absolutely standard. I suspect that within the suite of consultants that operate these models, including surveyors, there will always be slight differences, but basically with the same inputs, you will get roughly the same results out at the end. The only difference that I'm aware of is that within our work, we estimate the value of affordable housing components of development schemes using capitalised net revenues. So we say, what's the value to the housing association of the scheme? And we capitalise that and say, well, this is how much they can afford to pay for it. Now, I'm aware that some consultants will use a different way of doing that. Well, they'll basically say to the registered providers, how much will you pay for it? Now, we believe our method is better because we're putting in a price that we know that they can afford rather than what they might bid, because for various reasons sometimes RPs may overbid for affordable housing schemes. But sort of in a way it's a nuance that is important, but it is a difference, and you've asked for differences. Potential conflicts of interest. Well, just to say, I mean, I don't have any conflicts of interest, and nor do my colleagues. We've got no interest in property in Hampshire, or let alone in Basingstoke-on-Deane. One of the things that we are quite clearly faced with is that we're asking the people who may, for example, benefit from a low sill rate or a low target affordable housing policy about the inputs, and they have an opportunity to influence that. And the only way that we can deal with that, whilst meeting the guidance that we consult with the industry, is by challenging in the workshop some of the arguments put forward. For example, within the workshop, where we had the Homes and Communities Agency, we had a very lively debate about build costs between the Homes and Communities Agency, some of the house builders, and the housing associations, where there was quite a lot of challenging going on, separate from the process that we had set up as well. So I suppose in the round, the way that we deal with conflicts of interest is by challenging, trying to triangulate evidence as well. So not just taking evidence from one source, but saying, well, what other sources might back this up? And I hope that answers that question. Thank you.
Councillor Edith Watts. No questions. Councillor Gary Watts.
Thank you, Chair. How did we achieve 40% affordable target, which we've got at the moment, and also get money from 106? So why why is SIL less generous than the 106? Could you explain to me why?
Thank you. I've had a number of discussions with the development management about what is being achieved at the moment. My understanding is that not all schemes that are being built at the moment are delivering 40% affordable housing. I think for some of the applications that may be coming in now, there are maybe two main things that I think one might want to bear in mind. I think that there is the beginning of a mood of optimism, and I think an expectation of rising values. So I think some schemes are saying, well, it might be marginal now, but maybe it will be better in the future. And if the values don't change, they might decide not to build out their permissions. And the second thing is that I would draw your attention to the April 2013 process for reviewing affordable housing, where if one was only slightly cynical, one would say this is encouraging developers to put in policy compliant applications which might become renegotiated before being delivered. Now, I can't say whether that will be the case for I think the ones you have in mind, but I think it will remain a possibility until they're actually built out with 40%. I think we've looked at the viability modelling quite carefully in relation to this, and we've had, as I said, a number of discussions with development management about it in order to make sure that the understanding of where we are at the moment sort of fits with the modelling, because really that's what we are trying to model. The other part of your question was Section 106 and SIL. I mean, they are none of them more or less generous than the other. The big difference is that once the council sets a SIL rate later on down the line, that SIL rate is non-negotiable. So whereas Section 106 is negotiable, so if a scheme has viability problems, it can negotiate its Section 106. Under a SIL regime, if a scheme has viability problems, the only flex in the system is the affordable housing. And so in the same way that I would sort of counsel some prudence about setting affordable housing targets, I'd counsel prudence for SIL rates as well, because if the SIL rate is too high, there is a danger that affordable housing delivery will be compromised. So that's, I think, the big difference, I think.
Take the whole. Sorry, I missed the beginning. The whole premise is built on land value. Is a snapshot in time? Is that snapshot now?
Yes, that is. The guidance instructs the values to be current values, and that's on the basis that if those current values change significantly, then the process is reviewed. So it doesn't mean the local plan is reviewed, but that, for example, SIL rates would be reviewed. So if there was evidence from whatever source that house prices had increased by a step change within the borough, that would be the catalyst for reviewing a SIL rate. It may be, depending on how you decide to arrange things, you may also decide to review your affordable housing target as well at that stage, but I suspect that's slightly more difficult. But certainly the guidance is very clear about current values, and I think that's done in order to stop people speculating about what values might be in the future, because once you're into the realms of speculation, you could prove anything really, I think.
Thank you. Councillor Mr. James?
Thank you. At the start of the presentation, you talked about affordability and that you that wasn't part of your scope. And you said that it was added halfway through. Is it possible for you to, how was that rescoped, that piece of work, or was it just an add-on?
Thank you. When we first started, the brief for the study directed us to model around the existing affordable housing policy, which is obviously, as you know, 40% with primarily a social rent component being the major component. When we looked at the evidence base for that policy, parts of it were quite aged and where there had been sufficient changes since it was written to reduce its robustness, certainly at any sort of local plan examination. So the main work, now, forgive me, I can't remember exactly the dates, but I think the main part of the work was based on about 2007 or 2008 values. Since then, the grant funding regime for affordable houses has changed beyond recognition, in that there is essentially no grant funding for affordable housing on mixed tenure schemes. There is still some for this affordable only schemes, but not for mixed schemes. And of course, values have changed very significantly since that date as well. Now, we are aware that that part of that work was updated in 2010, but that only looked at small sites. So basically, the original affordable housing policy was based on some quite aged information. So there was that issue. And then we also, sort of through some initial playing with the figures, suggested that 40% affordable housing might be a problem in some parts of the borough. Through that process, we were asked to do some sort of initial testing to see whether that might be the case. And what that indicated was that there may well be problems with the 40% affordable housing target. So that aspect of work was then included within the scope. And there is a logic, I think, in determining affordable housing targets in conjunction with SIL as well, because I think to do one in isolation from the other isn't compliant with the spirit of the guidance, and also I think would be a much harder decision to take as well.
Thank you. Did you, in looking at the affordability, look at our updated strategic housing market assessment that informs that work of affordability?
My colleague Lynn Cousins certainly looked at it. I've looked at part of it. So yes, I mean, we are certainly aware of it, and parts of it are directly reflected in our work in terms of the affordable housing mix, which is informed by the allocations policy that's coming out of that SHMA.
And what does that all mean? Did it inform your work or not?
Sorry, yes. The simple answer is yes. It did, yes.
In relation to your meeting with the developers, what percentage of the developers were social developers? What percentage were from the private sector?
Well, housing associations, well, there was Sentinel and Sovereign, and I think those are the only... Oh, well, okay, yes, and the HCA as well, I suppose, yes, within that. Whereas Astor Homes, David Wilson and Bewley, and the companies represented by the Planning Bureau are clearly private sector. I would argue that probably the other companies that I mentioned there, people like Savills, other planning people, and are also have an interest in representing their clients, or are interested in their own rights. So in that sense, the registered providers are in a minority, although Sovereign and Sentinel clearly are the major social landlords in Basingstoke and Dean. So in stature, I suppose, we've got the majority.
And of those, you said that there were people present that were the small and medium developers, builders. Was there a percentage that were the smaller or medium builders?
Well, Bewley Homes would certainly be one of those, and also TA Fisher. It's not clear exactly who people like Wolfbomb Planning and DGG Planning are representing, but I would. Oh, okay, no, apparently, yeah, very small as well. Savills were there without briefs from their clients, but they would typically try and pick up clients from larger house builders and make representations to the SIL examination through that. So I suppose within that, I mean, there is a good spread, I would say.
Oxford's core strategy is 50% affordable, and that went through last week. It is how can Oxford or Manchester, which is again 50, or Newcastle deliver a much higher percentage of affordable housing? And Oxford's is a minimum of 50, and the percentage of affordable is higher than, and it is socially rented. How can that happen? What formula are they using?
I haven't read the viability assessments for those two locations, so I can't say definitively what they've used. The factors that have an impact on viability will be values, so I suspect that certainly for Oxford I would anticipate quite high values, and I would suspect that the premium on values is more significant than the premium on costs, so there's more value in the development process. I'm not aware of the scale of sites that Oxford has as well, so it may well be that if they are constrained in the amount of space that they have to develop housing, that will also further fuel values and allow them to take a higher affordable housing proportion. One of the other factors in there is what their SIL rate is planned to be as well. If they are proposing a very low SIL rate because they don't need much infrastructure, they may be able to ask for more affordable housing. And it is also possible, and this might apply, well, this does apply to Basingstoke and Deane as well, is that where a lot of the land is in public ownership, that land might be released below what might be assumed to be a market rate in order to facilitate development or to get the value out in some other way. So those are some suggestions, but I'm sorry I can't give you a detailed answer on those other pieces of work.
In your answer there, you said about the that Oxford may be not land rich, therefore that's why they're going for a higher percentage of affordable housing. So I suppose you're assuming then that Basingstoke is, because it is land rich and has the ability to develop more sites, we're going to go for a smaller. Is that what you're saying?
No, forgive me, I think probably I wasn't being very clear. It was more to do with where cities have got tight administrative boundaries and sort of few sites available to develop. That's likely just through basic economics to push up the price of development. Sorry, if you like, the value of development. So it was really that point rather than, if you like, attempting to understand whether they were sort of balancing the sort of absolute number of affordable houses as part of the relative delivery or not. I don't know that.
Councillor James, if you've got a few more questions, I'd like all the members to. Could you? Thank you. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Very interesting presentation. Thank you for that. I know the industry very well, and the one thing that came across straight away to me was the manner in which you approached this and the manner in which your descriptions were undertaken. and the number of meetings, private meetings I've sat in with developers where their lawyers have gone through this process to achieve the results that you've given us conclusions for. And it's a fascinating overlap of sitting inside the industry and then what you've given us this evening. So my first question to you is, I'd just like to explore your conflict of interest a little bit more. Would you like to explore for us and give us an example of some of the people that your company works for?
Yes, okay. So people that we have worked for are in the public and the private sector. At the very beginning of the presentation, I talked about viability studies. So there have been a number of local authorities in different parts of England and also Wales, but I think we can assume there's no particular conflict of interest there. Three Dragons also works for the development industry as well. We have done work for McCarthy and Stone that you should be aware of. And I have worked on studies for McCarthy and Stone in the north of England and in the Midlands. Three Dragons acts as the secretariat for the Retirement Housing Group. So the Retirement Housing Group is a body that sort of coordinates most, but not all, of the providers of retirement housing, and has recently, through my colleague Kathleen Dunmore, provided an overview of the viability of delivering sheltered housing and extra care housing. In terms of other developers, we are not acting, or have recently acted, as far as I'm aware, for any developers anywhere in Hampshire. We've certainly not been involved with McCarthy and Stone in any of their developments in this part of the world. Sorry? I don't think so. Certainly, unless you think one of my colleagues has. No, I haven't. No.
Yeah, what is the point of the
Thank you.
question?
I was intrigued because obviously the importance of the evidence to us and the methodology and how you've gone about it and what it's saying is important. And for me, looking at the list of clients from Barratt Homes to Kier Homes Partnerships to McCarthy and Stone and OH Properties, obviously Three Dragons has a relationship with the development industry. And very important for me is you also have a relationship, as you list as one of your clients, the House Builders Association, which represents the small building industry. They are directly lobbying local authorities and government on these very matters. And the issue I have with that is, to quote them, reflecting the problems of the development viability resulting from static or falling prices, to influence the regulations, pressing local authorities to be required to demonstrate that their adopted local plans will not obstruct development. I mean, those are organisations that, for me as a member looking at a piece of evidence, I need to be concerned about. And with all due respect, you didn't say the HBA, and for me that will be one of the ones I would have gone to straight away, just to say up front, look, yeah, we work for a very big lobbying, or an important lobbying part of the industry. So we need to register that because it is important, I think, for us and for me in terms of looking at the evidence. And as I say, I know the development industry, and for me that's incredibly important in the credibility of what you're saying this evening.
I don't believe the HBA are current clients, but I think I would need to check with my colleagues to actually confirm that, because you've raised an important issue, and I think the client list on the website would relate to past as well as current clients. So, I mean, given what we do is for the public and for the private sector, yes, there will be private sector clients on there. But in relation to whether we're conflicted because of any current involvement with the HBA or any of the other lobbying groups, no, you've raised a very important point, and I think I should respond, but I'm not able to do so at the moment. Certainly to say I'm I personally haven't done any work for the HBA, and I'm certainly not currently doing any, and I'm pretty sure my colleagues aren't either, but I can't say that definitively. So I will have to come back to this committee through...
Through Mr. Hunter.
Yep,
Yes.
indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. Just a couple of questions around the methodology, just quickly. In terms of the land value, one of the things that you said was in terms of a number of the deals that have been done recently in the town. And one thing we're very conscious of, quite a number of the deals recently have been grossly overvalued compared to where they should have been in the market. And that is something that concerns me in terms of your analysis of the urban area. Are you aware of those grossly overvalued elements, or did you just take them as read as that was what the developer paid for the site?
There are two parts to my answer, really. One is that a recorded land sale is a recorded land sale. It is evidence, irrespective of whether you think people over or underpaid for it. It is evidence. However, that doesn't mean that I can't take a judgment on it. And I suppose it would be fair to say that I have been surprised by the prices, the high prices of some of the sites. But if a willing buyer and a willing seller are happy to transact at those values, that is evidence. The other part of the answer is that if you're aware of the prices of those sales and how they might be used, you will probably have spotted that the threshold land values that we've tested against are lower than some of those sales. And certainly the main threshold land value of £1 million is quite a lot lower than a number of sales. And in that sense, you will see that we've used our judgment rather than taking it as read.
And again, it's the judgment bit that we need to understand and appreciate, and thank you for that. I guess the question that flows from that is obviously in the analysis, and this is interesting because in other viability analyses as part of other local plans, just as one example, Lambeth, for example, they make it very clear that you don't just fix the land value. Now, in your presentation, you fixed the land value. That is the fixed element. Everything else shifts, but the land value stays the same. And it was very interesting how Lambeth officers responded to a similar set of presentations and a similar set of arguments. Because they said, we would, however, point out that land values are not fixed and can flex to accommodate planning policy requirements, and it should not be assumed that planning policy must always flex to meet the requirements of landowners. That was a very important part of their analysis. It reflected in what the London Mayor has said, it's reflected in what other councils such as Exeter and Oxford have done. I appreciate the methodology you're showing us, I really do, but there are other examples out there, and I do take note of what those officers and those professionals have said as well. So the problem for me is you fixed one element, and here we have the conclusions. There is no analysis of the variable aspects to this, and Basingstoke was treated as one market. Basingstoke is not one market at all, as a town, let alone the borough. So there's an issue within that context, I think, as well. For me, in the simplicity of the approach leading to the quite serious conclusions that you're drawing.
Thank you. Certainly I would absolutely appreciate the impact on land values that that will stem from plan policies, and that would extend to SIL as well. And I think what you were in part referring to was the examination of the mayoral SIL, where the chief examiner, as was Keith Holland, very clearly said that part of the impact of SIL would be to reduce land values. And we have taken that factor into account when we've tried to judge where the threshold land value or values would be for Basingstoke and Dean. And that's part of the reason why we haven't just taken as read some of the very high land transaction values that we've been made aware of. So there's that point. I'd also like to say that my understanding is that whilst threshold land values will move, it's been my experience that they aren't quick to move. There is undeniably a time lag in threshold land values, and in a way I think we would be remiss in our advice if we were to entirely construct a set of viability arguments on our expectation of changes in land values in the future, which might flow through in due course as a result of changing policies, as well as different market forces as well. You'll be aware, I'm sure, that a lot of land transactions happen over a period of years, and part of it is sort of built on developer or landowners' hope value, and others are just because that's the way that they bank land in order to make it work. And yes, it isn't the council's responsibility to adjust its policies in order to accommodate mistakes that landowners might make in terms of what the price paid for land might have been. But on the other hand, it also has to recognise that if delivery of development is an important part of its local plan, it has to work within something the development industry is able to accept. Might not want to accept this, so some of the pressures I think that SIL will put on values isn't what the development industry wants to accept. But what we have to do as consultants is try and set out what we believe to be a reasonable basis for making decisions on, and then what you as a council have to do is actually to take the decisions, really. What I've tried to do today is to provide a framework and some interpretation of what I think it means, but actually where the judgment is about what level of affordable housing you in the end opt for is absolutely not my decision, and I would totally recognise that. It's up to you, and if you decide to set a very high affordable housing and a very high SIL rate, it might work, and it might not, but this is your judgment. And in the same way, if you set the affordable housing too low and the SIL rate too low, then clearly there are penalties for getting that wrong as well. I don't think within this there's any right answer. There's a range in which you could take decisions which are justifiable.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, set against what a number of authorities have done on that, and their actual local plans have been thrown out by inspectors because they went too low, they got it wrong, based upon going too far to the development industry side. My last point, Chair, my last question really relates to, in a sense, a lot of the development that we have in Basingstoke, a lot of the area that we have, is either on options, either directly already owned by developers, or is in arrangements and partnerships whereby those elements are already fixed from a developer perspective. They've already shelled out, they've already got them as part of their land bank. In the context of us in terms of policy, and this is important for me where your bit fits, I don't want your analysis, and the problem I have is I think it's far too close to the developer industry at the moment to be the get out of jail card for some of the most important bits of policy, if you like, we need in this borough: transport, the infrastructure and the affordable housing. So taking it forward at the moment, because of the way that you've gone about it, I have a fundamental problem with your methodology and where the real development picture is in Basingstoke and Dean as I know it. So for me, I'm trying to marry those two up, where you come at it from and what the real picture is, and at the moment I don't have that. I really don't. And my experience is direct because I know those developers and I know what their positions are. And I don't want them to have a get-out-of-jail-free card on affordable housing. And that's my worry, if you like, from what you've presented to us.
Sorry? Is the last point? It wasn't really a question, I don't think. Pardon?
Well, I'm not sure I can do anything other than sort of repeat. I don't have any direct conflicts. We've tried to use a sensible system of checks and balances and triangulation of information as is possible, and that tied in with experience elsewhere, and sort of both our own experience elsewhere and others' experience elsewhere suggests that, well, we might not have got it perfectly right, but we're in the right ballpark. And I think I am quite clear about that.
Thank you, Dominic. Councillor Mrs. Cubitt, sorry.
Thank you. Just on the basis of your presentation, it kind of begs the question: why do developers and building companies want to build on greenfield sites? Because your analysis tells us that the net residual value on a greenfield site is substantially lower than the urban site, and yet that doesn't make any sense to me, because I know that building companies actively seek to buy greenfield sites because I know they make greater profits than they do if they have to build on brownfield sites. And yet if I've understood your analysis, the threshold was 1.3 on the urban land per hectare and only 400,000 per hectare on the greenfield sites. So I'd be very interested in your commentary on that. And also just one other thing in relation to that same question. I've been told that 1 acre is worth 1 million with planning on it. 1 acre, not 1 hectare. So I don't understand how 1 hectare can be worth 400,000. It's a big difference. And I'm talking about greenfield sites.
Okay, thank you. The value of land seems to differ around a number of factors. Large-scale greenfield sites, such as might be used to stick a sort of 1,000 dwellings on or 3,000 dwellings, are relatively expensive to develop because they generally require substantial utilities and on sort of within site roads and all manner of things in order to bring them to a state where they can start to build houses on them. And furthermore, the net developable proportion of the overall land area will be smaller than, for example, on a smaller site. So, for example, one of the case studies we modelled was 3 dwellings, albeit at different densities, and a small site, such as an acre site at the edge of an urban area or on the edge of a village, where it's able to plug straight into existing services and is able to access a road network very simply, will be worth a lot of money, whereas some thousands of acres in roughly the same location, you will have a set of land a long, long way away from the ability to plug into services. And because of that, it costs an awful lot more to bring forward large-scale greenfield sites.
So yes, I hear that, but the SIL will pay for the strategic infrastructure. So you're actually just talking about the roads. You're not talking about any other significant infrastructural supports, are you? Just very quickly, because I'm very aware. I mean, Chairman, I really think we're going to have to ask this consultant if he very kindly stay a little bit longer.
Because we have other consultants sitting at the back of the room waiting to give their presentation. This is going on a time. This is just questions to the presenter. We debate this tomorrow. Well, then allow the other councillors to have their chance as well. Don't hog the time. That's my request, Mrs. Hewitt.
Yes, SIL will be paying for the off-site infrastructure at the moment through, for example, the sort of tariff system of 106 that the council operates for planning obligations. Developments are pooled. Contributions from developments are pooled and are spent in a number of different locations around the borough. And in a way, that is a system that's not totally unlike the way SIL works. Really, money is collected in one spot and paid for in another. So, in addition to that process, there is still provision of roads within the overall site. And so on a large site, for example, you have to provide roads within the confines of a site that's suitable for buses to go on and so on. So they're higher spec roads than that which you'd have for a small driveway for 3 dwellings or so.
Just very quickly, because we've been limited, what is the return to developer that you've got in the box normally? What is that, 30% return or 50% return?
The return to the developer, which is the sort of industry standard return, is 20%. There is some argument to say that it should be more, and the reasons behind those arguments are that banks won't lend developers money unless they are able to prove that they're making a certain return. They don't want them making marginal investments.
And where's the financial cost of carry built into that then? Is that in the build cost or in the deducted from the?
In terms of the finance cost is part of the cost of development, so it's got a 7.5% finance cost built into the modelling.
So build cost, you've got a 7.5. That's included in that bit. Okay, and just in terms of planning, when you talk about phasing and how the larger projects are very difficult for builders, is it not true that it depends on how the accountant spreads the costs of the project? And very often developers can choose to balloon the profit at the end, but make it look as if it's not making very much money during the phasing, because we've obviously experienced significant developments here in Basingstoke where there's a phase, it gets released, and there's another phase. And we all know, I mean, many of us who are in the private sector, that there's many ways you can skin a cat, and there's many ways in which you can apportion the costs of the project. You can upfront the costs and suddenly it doesn't look viable, or you can back end the costs and then you take some of the profit during the life of the phase.
The modelling we've used takes a straightforward interpretation of sort of registering the costs when we think they will occur as part of the development. So if you like, we're not following the developer's guidance about flows of money and how they work their costs. What we're doing is looking at the number of years it would take to develop the site and where different costs are incurred in order to make that happen, and then modelling the finance costs on the money you'd need to borrow and when that would then come back in through selling the dwellings.
We have 3 minutes, Councillor Mrs. Q, but I'd like...
I've got one last question.
Dominic has a train to catch at 12 minutes past 8.
Well, I'd like to ask a question, please.
If it's very brief, please, because I'd like
It's
Councillor Leeks to follow you. Leek to follow you.
We own, obviously, as you know, 2,000 hectare site, and obviously not all of that will be developed. But firstly, we don't have a 7.5% financial carry on it, and we've already paid for it. So in terms of calculating residual costs on land that's already been paid for, how do you go about doing that? Because there's none of that cost of carry.
The developer profit and the finance relates to the developer, not the landowner. So if you like, there are actually sort of 2 areas of value. There is a value to a landowner. So say, for example, if you were a farmer and you had agricultural land at £20,000 per hectare, that then on a large greenfield site becomes worth £400,000 per hectare. There's some form of uplift in there. It's not without cost, though. There'll be a significant cost within that to bring it forward for development. But so as a council, as landowner, the council, I can only speculate what the council may have paid for the land. Okay, so if the council decides to release that land at a lower threshold land value than I've modelled at, then the figures change. But that's up to the council as landowners, which is a different discussion, I think, than what we're having here.
Councillor, do you have a question?
I just want to understand the SIL payment. If we take your example of 3,000 dwellings and your recommendation of 30% affordable housing, what was the SIL is it per dwelling? Is that what?
Yeah.
What? How is it? Ah, well, I didn't understand it.
It says 1,500.
There's a residual allowance of 1,500 per dwelling for what might be left for Section 106, but the actual SIL payment is calculated on per square metre of floor area. So on average, depending on what size dwelling you might think was an average dwelling, between 85 to 95 square metres is an average 3-bedroom dwelling. Some are bigger than others.
So my supplementary is, on 3,000 houses, how much would the total SIL come to on the assumption of your 30%?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to call a halt there. I apologise to Councillor Mr. Tucker and Councillor Sherlock. Did you have any pressing questions? Councillor Sherlock? Because we can always direct questions back through the officers, and if you had any supplementaries, Councillor James. If you'd like to pose them to Mr. Hunter, he'll forward them to Dominic. Dominic, I would like to thank you very much for the presentation this evening. Sorry it's been a bit of a rush, but it's going to be some useful information to absorb. Thank you very much. I'm not now going to have a quick comfort break, so we change over our presenters, and we'll start again at 5 minutes past. Right, members, if we can reconvene. Are you going to introduce this, Mark? Because I've already had a word with the consultants about their approach. Quite happy with that.
Thank you, Chair. As members will be aware, a presentation was provided to this committee at the end of May to update on progress with the local plan transport assessment. This evening, a further presentation will be given by Nigel Walkden and Colin McKenna from consultants Parsons Brinkerhoff on the additional work that's been completed since that time. This includes further mitigation work on some key junctions and consideration of each of the scenarios on the key junctions on the network. Just to say that the outcomes of this work in terms of the junction improvements is being fed into the infrastructure delivery plan in order to ensure that the necessary infrastructure can be provided in tandem with the local plan development itself.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. As is said, we want to move forward from our presentation last time. We took you through quite a lot of the methodology, but just to recap on a few items, so we're all on the same page. Last time we took you through the fact that it's the junctions within the town which are the problems in terms of capacity for sometimes current demand, but certainly as the growth in traffic due to a number of factors, including your local plan allocations, will cause much more stress on those junctions. We did present a model last time that highlights how we've arrived at where those pressures are at the moment and how much worse things would become from the growth of your 4 scenario. And apologies in advance for the labelling of those scenario, where it says that it's a cabinet approved scenario. That is not the case. Literally, the cabinet have not approved the scenario, but that's so. If we could look at those scenarios as scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4, rather than they are cabinet approved as such. We in looking at the junctions, we've looked at those that are most affected by local plan development. So we've looked in detail at those junctions, and we've developed models that represent the movements at those junctions, so we can look at what the precise queuing and delays are at the moment, and also in the future from traffic growth. And it's those junctions that we've been working on, extending our analysis to more junctions, that's taken our time since we last presented to you. A reminder, the fact that our analysis throws up the worst case. Some of the delays that are represented in our analysis wouldn't actually happen in practice because congestion is a self-limiter. And what happens is when congestion gets to a certain stage, the peak hour spreads and people find different ways of achieving their travel behaviour. So people just don't put up with delays of 10 minutes, and you tend to have a reaction to that, for example. And the level of analysis that we've undertaken is really appropriate to the stage in the process that you're at, in terms of looking at your local plan developments, trying to give yourself the confidence that your local plan is deliverable. Your infrastructure delivery plan will stand a good chance of mitigating the impact, the adverse impact of development over the planned period. So that's our analysis is really appropriate to that level of consideration. On that point, I'll pass over to Nigel Walkden, take us through where we left off last time.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that, Colin. As we've been through the methodology previously, what I think I'll do is basically go through that very, very briefly this time and not go into too much detail. So in terms of what we're looking at in demand, in terms of the local plan
Basically, this diagram shows how we've actually put our demands together. It should be emphasised that the different bands within the graph are they're symbolic only. They don't represent specific quantities. So basically, we have a 2012 base, and that's where we are at the present. We know what the flows are on the network, and to come up with traffic flows for 2029, what we've actually looked at is a 2029 reference case, which includes all growth between 2012 and 2029 in terms of background growth on the network, in terms of committed development, and in terms of impact from the neighbouring districts and boroughs. And that gives us a reference case 2029 in which we have a sort of no local plan scenario. And then on top of that, what we're doing is we're looking at the impacts of the local plan specifically. So Colin mentioned that we were looking at different scenarios, and we've actually looked at 4 different scenarios. 4 different scenarios have been considered. And if you have a look in this table, it basically shows the different quantities of development in terms of accommodation for households and employment floor space between the different scenarios. Yeah, so this is actually on page 8 of the handout. So if you have a look at the number of dwellings as part of the local plan vary by very little between the 4 different scenarios, and the employment floor space is constant throughout the 4 scenarios. So really, the actual total quantities of developments don't really vary across the 4 scenarios, although some of the locations do. We're looking at certain pieces of infrastructure as part of the local plan, and the 4 scenarios here are indicated by A, B, C and D. We've also looked a little bit at a full western bypass to the west of Basingstoke, and that has been given its separate scenario. So I think last time we went through a couple of examples of junctions of where we could actually go for mitigation, and we could actually mitigate the impacts of the local plan. But this time we can look at things in a little bit more detail because we've actually got some more results. So what we'd like to talk about first of all is some of the impacts on the links, and by the links I mean the road network in Basingstoke, but not the junctions. So we're looking at the network between the junctions in this case. So basically we're looking at different parts of Basingstoke. This plan here actually looks at the radial routes into and out of Basingstoke. So we have the A33 to the northeast, the A30 to the southwest, the A339 to the northwest, and so on. And what this graph is actually showing is, if you can see the red bar in the middle of the graph, which runs from top to bottom, that is where capacity lies on each of the links, each of the different links in the road network shown. So basically what this diagram is showing is that for 3 of the links, they will actually be exceeded in a 2029 scenario. And actually the B3400 and the A339 are actually exceeded currently in 2012 on a regular basis. Also the A340 is also exceeded with current levels of traffic flow on a regular basis, if not every day. But the rest of the radial routes into and out of Basingstoke in the AM peak actually cope quite well with the 2029 flows.
I was just, sorry, can I? So far, in terms of the bar and the capacity issue, because it's quite an important point.
Councillor Mrs. Tucker.
I wonder, sorry, if you could just repeat what you said regarding the A33, please.
Or the A340.
It was the
A33.
Okay. If you, I'll try to explain in a bit more detail what the graph is trying to show here. If you look at the red line on the right hand, which tends to run down the centre, the red line running from top to bottom basically shows that where capacity is for each of these roads in the network. At the bottom there is a scale which shows the amount of traffic per hour, the number of vehicles per hour you could actually get on each of these sections of road. Now, the light sort of cream colour within the graph basically shows the 2012 traffic flows where we are today on the network. So this amount of traffic will occur regularly presently. The lighter orange colour basically shows the increasing traffic between 2012 and 2029, which will happen anyway without the local plan. And then the darker orange colour shows the impact of the local plan on top of that in 2029. So if all those, if the cream, the light orange and the darker orange is to the left of the red line, then that road in the network will be in capacity in 2029. If they push through the red line and they're to the right of the red line, then basically those links in the network will be over capacity. Is that okay with everybody?
Councillor Mrs. Cubitt.
Sorry, I completely understand, but what I can't understand, I completely understand what, yeah, no, I completely understand what your graph's demonstrating, but what it's saying currently is that we've got massive amount of capacity as is in 2012 with the A33. And what I would like you'd explain to me is how you can arrive at that conclusion when the last time you came to see us, you demonstrated some pretty, I mean, I'm feeling like this is the water cycle study Mark II again. You've gone away, come back with something that tells us that there's not a capacity problem because somebody didn't like what you told us last time.
No, what we're trying to say here, this is the capacity of the actual road. It's the capacity of the road between the junctions. There is a different capacity when you actually get to a junction because that's a constraint on capacity. So what we were showing before, that there are problems when you get to the junctions, but here what we're actually showing is that in a lot of the cases, the physical road itself away from the junctions has enough capacity.
So today I was on the A33 coming from Reading, and from the Wellington Arms it was standstill both ways and there was full traffic all the way up to Wellington Arms coming into Basingstoke. Is that what you would call capacity, or would you call that spare capacity?
That delay is caused by the junctions and not the physical width of the road. Okay. So moving on, if we go to slide number, shall we do number 12? Yeah, slide number 12 is basically showing the AM peak outbound flows on the same links. So the A339 and the A40 in 2029, sorry?
Yeah,
Could you just distinguish between, could you say Kingsclere Road or Hackwood Road, because there are two bits of the A339, so it's a bit confusing for. I mean, I'm only interested in the Kingsclere Road, but others might be interested in Hackwood.
Members, please, can we let the presentation move on, please?
Okay. In this case, the A339, it's actually taken at Hackwood Road. Okay. But as I tried to explain, most of the problems are actually caused when you get to the junctions, and it's queuing back from the junctions which are actually cause the problems. But the actual physical link capacity, the road capacity itself away from the junctions, isn't an issue. And this is shown in most of the roads here.
Members, I would appreciate the courtesy that you listen to the presenters. Thank you.
Okay. If we go to slide number 13, what we're actually showing here is the link capacity. Again, it's the road capacity away from the junctions, actually on Ringway, on different sections of Ringway. So we've divided it up into south, east, north, and west, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. And again, some of the sections will remain within capacity in 2029 in the worst case scenario that we're looking at, but certainly the sections to the east and the north are likely to be the worst affected, and some of them not just in the local plan scenario, but even without the local plan. we move on slightly to slide number 15, what we can then actually look at is on some of the actual roads within the ringway itself, so within the centre of Basingstoke. And from the graphs that we're actually showing here, again, you know, we've got the three scenarios. We've got 2012, 2029 without development, and 2029 with the local plan. We can see that most of the actual roads that we've looked at still remain within capacity in a 2029 worst case scenario. There's Churchill Way, the centre of Churchill Way, which is the bottom graph, which is actually showing we are just pushed slightly over capacity in a 2029 scenario with the local plan. So moving on slightly from that, if we go to slide number 17, just to summarise what I've been telling you, is that some of the roads do have a significant impact from the local plan development itself, but a number of the links, so that the physical road links away from the junctions themselves, will actually be over capacity in a 2029 scenario without the local plan. But what I hopefully have shown you, the other thing that has been shown on these slides, is that there are 4 scenarios shown on each road link, and I think it shows that there's very little difference between each of the 4 scenarios that we're actually looking at. Moving on to slide number 18, what we're trying to show in this slide is a difference in the flows on some of the roads through the different scenarios. So we're looking at scenario 1 and scenario 2, and the actual numbers shown on the road links here are the differences in flows in a peak hour. The boxes show different developments in different parts of Basingstoke in the different scenarios. But the actual network flows, the difference in network flows, we're talking about up to between scenario 1 and scenario 2, 50, maximum of 50 vehicles per hour on any road link in the network, which is less than 1 vehicle per minute. So it's showing that between these 2 scenarios, that the flow link, the actual flows don't change by a great deal between scenarios.
Yes, Councillor Watts.
Committee. So I've asked the people in this committee, and the committee endorsed it when the consultants were last here, for account to be taken of the current and proposed developments in Andover. We have a little line ending up to dot, which is Andover, but we don't seem to have any data about the effects of those developments. Now, there are 2 roads from Andover that come together in the junction in the middle of Whitchurch, a 5-way junction. One of those is Blosswood Lane, and the traffic on that road, which I think is C22, is going to be affected by development on the same road at Pickett Peace. There's some current development of Pickett 20, there's massive development at East Anton. Why has that not been included in this study?
Direct question. Did you include that flow from Andover?
The Andover flow should be included there, yes. It's actually there in the base case. So it's there in both cases, and it's actually there in the base case. So it doesn't change. What we're trying to show here is a difference in flow because of the Basingstoke and Dean local plan.
Where can I see the figures for the predicted 2029 Andover flows?
The actual flows specific to Andover haven't been shown in this presentation. What we're trying to show is the impact of the Basingstoke and Dean local plan, rather than the actual flows particular to Andover.
But as
I think we were required to cooperate across boundaries, and it's quite clear that the B3400 at the West End is far more affected by large volume development in Andover than it will by the smaller developments in Whitchurch and Overton. But I have no confidence in this because I can't see the figures. Second question is, in the cases of Whitchurch and Overton, it's not just the junctions that are a problem, it's because of the narrowness of the streets. And I mean, there's a congestion there now because of that, and it's bound to increase.
Yeah, I mean, the point taken about the actual widths of the road is taken. What we're actually doing here is not looking at the width of the road per se. We're actually looking at mitigating the impacts of a local plan. So it's not just a question of trying to cure situations which will arise in future. It's trying to cure the impacts of a particular situation that we're dealing with.
Just a quick question, Councillor Watson. Following up on your comment, you said that the Andover figures are in your base set of statistics, if you will, that are leading towards these conclusions. So they've been amalgamated. All that, as far as I can understand, they haven't been split out as a separate set of figures, which is why you won't see them. That's in the presentation. It's as simple as that. If you want to get back to the raw data, you will probably see them. Is that?
Well, I don't think it's
correct?
raw data. Raw data is current, and what we're talking about is predictions. But who is dealing with mitigating the effect of the developments in Test Valley? Surely within our borough, that's our responsibility. I've got no confidence in this report at all.
I think that question needs to go to our officers who are dealing with the cross-border issue. What I'm trying to get across this evening is the assessment of the problems relating to the development of the local plan for Basingstoke and Dean, which should take into account that automatically, and this is what I understand has happened, adjacent developments. Getting nods from the consultants.
I would like to see the data then, please.
Request noted. Councillor Tucker.
Sorry, on the same subject, we did refer to the development in Berkshire as well. And can I be assured that that is within these figures or not? The proposed developments in Berkshire.
Mr. Hunter?
Just from my recollection from when this was presented last time, and I think slide 6 demonstrates it, that the base case picks up those committed developments it talks about the impacts of the neighbouring districts. And when we looked at it before, I think there was one that was missing, which was Wokingham, which is in Berkshire. And that's been added in since that point. So it's building in the base case, so you've got them in there.
Thank you. Off you go.
Okay. Moving on to slide 19, we're looking at a flow scenario again between two different scenarios. We've got scenario 1 and scenario 3, and again, looking at the actual figures on the roads, on the network, we can see that the figures are very, very small. They're sort of in double figures maximum, and the largest figure there really is 51 vehicles per hour along one of the roads in the network, which again is less than 1 vehicle per minute. So the flow changes are very low between those two scenarios. Moving on to slide 20, this is showing the difference between the western scenario and the eastern development scenario. So some of the flows on this diagram, the difference in flows are actually larger because there's a western bias and an eastern bias to the developments. So this is actually showing some larger flows, but they're still really within the sort of figures you would expect given the levels of development in the different locations. Which one?
We don't have pictures. We don't have that. It's not obvious to see. Where it points to, I don't know what road that is.
South. It's south from. It's from the crop roundabout. South. I can't remember the name of the road. It's heading south off the A33. Yeah, there's the A33.
That's
Yes, yes, that's
Yes.
yes, that's correct. Yes.
It's all basing.
It's all bit.
It's all basing. It's all basing. Unfortunately, this is one of the difficulties. We're trying to orientate ourselves locally onto this, and you focused on a road that we're not quite sure what it is.
I'm assuming this is the motorway?
Yeah, this is motorway. This is railway.
Could we
We try to that down roundabout? That's probably
almost another time what road it was?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back.
I just can't remember the name of this road.
Yeah, we'll confirm it later. We're looking at statistical information primarily here, and where we can identify it, we'll chase it up and find out which one that is.
I think that the
Members, can we get the presentation rolling? Questions, please, afterwards. Well, yeah,
Hasn't been allocated, so why have we got 1,000 homes in number 3?
Mark?
Just to clarify, this is showing the different scenarios. So in one scenario it's showing an eastern bias, in another scenario it's showing a western bias. So under the western bias, it's showing Hampton Fields and what could happen if you lump development in one particular area. So that's why it's referring to Hampton Fields in that example there.
Well,
Yes.
I really don't understand what this
Well,
slide is trying to show. Sorry.
it's effectively showing what the difference is between if you allocate all to the east, all to the west, or you look at the different options that Cabinet have considered previously. So it's really showing you what the effects would be if you put development in different parts of the town, or that you concentrate it in different parts of the town.
Okay, I understand that you can't give me the information at the moment, but I'm talking about an area I know terribly well, and there's two axes under the railway bridge, and the railway bridge is crossing through that blob, the brown blob, right? And that road that you're citing will have 428 vehicles per. Is going to go under one small bridge, which is Milking Pen Lane, which is a high conservation area, and then going back out past the railway cottages under again a very narrow railway bridge. So, well, it must be because the railway bridge is the railway line is there. So, is it a new bridge? Is it a new road?
No, I think the way that you should look at this is these are flows based upon unconstrained demand. If development is allowed to continue unconstrained and people are allowed to travel in an unconstrained manner, this is the demand that they would place on the network. It's not necessarily the flows that would actually be physically possible.
I appreciate that, but okay, we'll have to go offline. But that road is going under the railway bridge, and it's going back under the railway bridge.
I think some of these scenarios, you can't treat them as being absolute. They are scenarios to make an evaluation. If we tried to be absolute with all these numbers, we get nowhere. You've got to use them in analysis like this for comparison purposes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next slide, slide 21. On the left-hand side here, we have a map of Basingstoke, the road links within Basingstoke, and the junctions highlighted are the junctions which are going to be noticeably affected by the local
Members,
plan.
please, we're trying to listen to a presentation. Yeah, I know. If you want to explain to it, please afterwards, but give the courtesy to the presenters.
Sorry, apologies for that. Slide page 21. So what? It's gone back, hasn't it?
You press the, yeah. Yeah, you press the mouse rather than the keyboard. If you move the mouse, it moves.
Yeah. Okay. So what we're trying to show in this slide on the left-hand side are the junctions which will be affected by the local plan.
Councillor Mrs. Cubitt, please.
In terms of the worst-case scenario that we've been examining. So as you can see, that there are a significant number of junctions which could be potentially affected under worst case scenario. Whereas on the right, what we're trying to do is prioritise the junctions that we're actually looking at in terms of mitigation. So in terms of tranche 1, these are the junctions that we to date have looked at or are in the process of looking at, and tranche 2 are the junctions that we will be looking at very, very shortly.
Forgive me,
Yes.
on the left-hand side, you've obviously got the bypass proposed with the 2 junctions that would be relevant to it. Are you looking on the right at those actual roundabouts that exist now in terms of your analysis, and you would still feed in the hypotheticals as and when? Am I reading that right? Forgive me.
Yeah, I think I understand what you say. I think yes, that is the case. So yeah, at the moment, yeah, there are 18 junctions there, which are a prioritised list really of what we're going to be looking at as part of this study. If we go on to the next slide, I'm going to go through this quite quickly because we went through this last time. I mean, basically, we're looking at a couple of junctions here, which are sort of typical, looking at what the impacts are and how we've actually looked at mitigating some of these impacts. So I think I'll go through the example of the Binfields roundabout. And that's actually on slide 23 onwards. So if we have a look at this, the yellow figures show the baseline 2029 scenario, and the red figures show what the flows will be under a worst case scenario with the local plan. So for the example of the A33 West, there's a significant increase in flow, for example, on that arm of the roundabout. So we're talking about an increase of 500 vehicles per hour in the morning peak and 700 vehicles per hour in the evening peak. On to the next slide. We're looking at delays per vehicle under the unconstrained worst case scenario, and the yellow figures show the pre-local plan scenario, and the red figures show the local plan scenario without any improvements, and the green figures show a local plan scenario with improvements. So again, taking the A33 West, there's about a 48-second delay in the baseline scenario, which would increase significantly to over 400 seconds in the no mitigation scenario, and that can actually be reduced again back to around 45 seconds if mitigation is in place. If we go on a couple of slides now, onto slide number 26. We're looking at the queue lengths on some of the entries to the roundabout. And again, if we look at the A33 West as an example, there's about 25 vehicles queuing typically in the AM peak in the baseline scenario without the local plan, which would increase significantly in the unconstrained local plan scenario. But again, with the mitigation that we're proposing, that can actually be mitigated quite successfully at that arm.
Councillor James.
Just so I
Very quickly, please.
Just as I understand that one on page 26, so you're looking at the moment we've got queues of 25 cars. With the local plan, it's going to be 265. With the mitigation, it's going to be 14. Is that what you're saying? So you're saying there's going to be less queues than we have now? Okay.
That's correct.
No, it's less queues than we would have on the network anyway in a 2029 scenario without the local plan. Basically, the yellow figures, the 25 are the 2000 is the 2029 scenario if the local plan doesn't go ahead, and the green figures are with the local plan after mitigation at that arm of the roundabout. So if we go on a couple of slides onto slide number 28, we can see some of the mitigations that we've actually been looking at this roundabout. So you can see that on most of the approaches we're looking to actually widen the approaches to the roundabout and increase the number of lanes in quite long flare lengths at that roundabout, and also to signalise the roundabout in some locations. So basically signalise all of the arms and increase some of the exit widths anyway.
Councillor Mr. Cubitt, please allow the presentation to proceed.
So it basically shows that, we're talking about significant increases in the amount of traffic, and we're effectively talking about widening most of the approaches by adding an extra lane there. So it's going to require some significant improvements. Moving on a few slides now onto slide number 35.
Briefly, what's the flare mean?
For example, when you approach a roundabout, or any junction, sometimes you get a widening of the approach, and that widening is the actual flare, and it's over a certain length of road. Yeah, sometimes you get a widening, for example, going from one lane to two, so you can actually have two vehicles there. Yeah. Moving on to slide 35, what we're actually showing in this map is the junctions that we've looked at to date. The actual costs of mitigation are shown as a sort of traffic light around the outsides of the circles in a sort of green, yellow, red pattern. And the centre of the circles, the colour of the centre of the circles relates to the effectiveness of the mitigation as we've looked at it to date. So some junctions can be mitigated more effectively than other junctions. And if you look on the right hand side, we've actually come up with some costings for mitigations to date. And the costings vary significantly depending upon what is required under this worst case scenario at the junctions shown. I think the costings at the moment, because it's 16 years to the completion of the local plan, some of the costings are preliminary at this stage, and there are certain things that we can't cost for with any certainty. So we've included a contingency of about 45%, which is actually built into the cost. In terms of the worst junction there, we're looking at junction 13, which is actually on the A30 on Winchester Road. And basically there's a significant cost there associated with that, and that is because there is not just an improvement at that junction, but there's going to have to be a widening on either side of the junction up to the previous junction and the next junction on the A30 itself. So that is a major improvement which will need to go ahead under this worst case scenario if it ever materialises.
Take questions afterwards, please, Mr. Cubitt. That's the whole plan of this evening, to allow the presentation to proceed.
Okay, moving on to the next slide, we've tried to do a little bit of analysis of how the Western Bypass may mitigate the flows under the scenarios that we're looking at. So on slide 36, we'll take slide 36 as an example. The blue routes on the three maps shown are the existing routes through the network. So the top left-hand diagram there is showing traffic coming down the M3 and heading around Ringway and heading out of Basingstoke in a northwest direction. Whereas the yellow flows show that some of that traffic now may actually head further down the M3, down to junction 7 of the M3, and then head north on a new Western Bypass. And this is under a 2029 scenario. So there is a figure on that top left-hand diagram of 220 trips, which is a sort of preliminary, very preliminary estimate of the number of vehicles making that movement in 2029 that may divert onto a western bypass. Yeah, these figures are actually per hour in a morning peak period. Similarly, the top right-hand diagram is showing traffic from the southwest, which is basically coming in, and some of these vehicles may actually transfer onto a western bypass, either from the A30 or from the M3. And similarly, the bottom diagram again is showing that to the west of Basingstoke, you probably get 100 vehicles through a particular route that exists at the moment, transferring onto the western bypass. So, from a very preliminary estimate, the number of vehicles that actually would transfer onto the western bypass are not significant, and you would still be left with quite significant problems throughout the rest of the network. Moving on to slide 40, we're really almost finished the study that we're undertaking at the moment. We're really in the final stages of stage 3 on this diagram, where we're looking at the last few junction models and costing mitigations to actually go into the transport assessment, which should be released by us shortly. So, in summary, and to take this forward, I mean, it's worth saying that, as Colin's mentioned earlier, this really is a sort of worst case scenario in terms of how we've actually looked at this. And it's a very sort of high level nature study. And the demand that we're actually showing here, or I've said it previously, is unconstrained demand. If the demand was allowed to grow and there was capacity on the network, this is what the demand would be. But obviously there isn't the capacity there. And traffic in reality will not travel, it will not queue under these circumstances. We think that at this stage of the process that there is enough detail here to take forward in terms of the local plan, to take forward to the examination in public and to a planning inspector to actually make a decision on the soundness and the viability of the developments here. Obviously, when you get down to a planning application stage, you will need more detailed work as to the mitigation that actually is required. So, in terms of what we've looked at, we looked at similar traffic impacts from different local plan scenarios, and numerous links and junctions that we have seen will be over capacity even without any interventions in the 2029 scenario. And there are 18 junctions that we're looking at, and 6 that we've still got to look at, but we will finish our study shortly. In terms of the initial costs, we've actually looked at that for 12 junctions. We deliberately not looked at the Black Dam junction, which is a significant junction, and it will be in future as well, because the Highways Agency themselves are actually conducting a study at Black Dam at the moment, and we're waiting for the results of that. And in terms of the Western Link Road, I think the initial results to us suggest that the benefits really won't be justified, and that from a cost-benefit point of view, that the better results can probably come from junction improvements elsewhere within Basingstoke, and that as things move on, there may be analysis required of further junctions, which haven't as yet to date been considered as part of this study. So I think I'd just like to conclude to say that that's where we're at. We will be concluding our study very shortly.
Thank you very much. We now have got a scheduled time of finishing at 9:30. Is that absolute for you? We will see how questions go. Once again, we've got members in the audience. Can I have an indication who would like to speak? Councillor Behrman, Councillor Tomlin. Anybody else? No? I've got Councillor Cubitt. I'd like to get the councillors from the floor up here first, and then I'll start with you, Councillor Cubitt, and I'll run around the table this way. And bearing in mind the time, who would like to be first, gentlemen? Councillor Behrman. Bearing in mind there's a lot of people who...
I understand that, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Very quickly, just a point of correctness. It's not Gauger Road, it's Gauger Avenue. You refer to it several times as Gauger Road. Beyond that, I'm firstly trying to understand what your brief was, and whether your brief was just to look at vehicular traffic, whether it was to include any sorts of modal shift for mitigation, and if it was, why it's not there. If it wasn't, then of course you can't be blamed for not doing what you were not asked to do.
Okay. Yes, we haven't looked at modal shift as part of this study. One, because the tools to do so effectively haven't been available in the timescales that we've been looking at. We've had a very sort of compressed timescale to look at this, and to properly consider modal split, you need certain models to be developed to a certain standard, which would have taken significantly longer. But what I will say is that because we haven't looked at modal shift, we're looking at the highway impacts from a worst case point of view, because we've just assumed that if the developments go ahead and people can travel at the time periods that they wish to travel, and that is in the peak periods, then they will all be loaded onto the network at that time. And I think the purpose of the study is that to see that if we can actually physically mitigate that, and that mitigation is affordable, then it makes the local plan viable, whether there's mode transfer or not.
Am I not right in suggesting, though, that all guidance from central government and elsewhere is that modal shift should be a major component factor in these exercises?
Can I just clarify that the consultant's role was only to look at the vehicular traffic. It is the council's role now to consider the impact of this study and to consider how to mitigate best the growth of traffic. One way might be to improve the lot of cyclists and pedestrians, to improve public transport, to do all sorts of other things. So that's now a stage for the council to consider.
With respect, I'm not sure, much as I appreciate the talents of my colleagues, that they're all up to doing the professional analysis of extra cycle, bus and rail services you'd need to achieve the mitigation. Just then, two last things then. Firstly, taking your first scenario, the Binfields roundabout, which I happen to know moderately well, if one introduced 4 lanes round it, which I'll come back to, but what consideration, bearing in mind that it is not only a vehicular route, but it is also a major pedestrian route between the urban settlement of Chinham and to some extent Popley through to the Chinham shopping centre. There's no illustration how the pedestrians are taken care of.
Yes, it's something that we haven't looked at the present time. It is something that Basingstoke indeed will need to take on board and look at in future.
Presumably that would have a noticeable cost impact on your cost estimates.
It will have a cost implication, although the cost implications for walking and cycling are considerably less than what they are for mitigating traffic impacts of this nature.
My last question, and bearing in mind that I could carry on for a long time, but I appreciate I mustn't. My last question is, can you point me to somewhere in the near vicinity of a roundabout embracing 4 lanes that's working without too much carnage?
From my local knowledge, I'm afraid I can't know. But there are certainly 4-lane circulatory roundabouts that actually do work within the
Junction 11 on the M3.
M4.
The M4, sorry. Junction 11's got 4 lanes, 5 lanes in some places.
It's rather bigger, I would submit, but anyway, yes, thank you. I think I've had my fill. I would, if there's time left at the end, which I doubt, I've got other questions, but I'll leave it to that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Tomlin.
Thank you, Chair. That's really building on what Councillor Beerman has just said. It's the A33 Binfields roundabout. I'm very keen. It's probably not the time. Whether we can ask the officers, can we have some information about how your mitigation works? It does seem as though it's a magic wand, because 639 cars queuing down to 22, it does beg a belief, but, you know, I'm certainly not a transport specialist, but I do use that roundabout. And also the sheer amount of work just on this one particular roundabout, whilst it shows it can be achieved, it's probably not your remit. I guess it's the council's. Will it be achieved, in the sense it takes up a massive amount of land grab to do it, and it's how it's a mitigation. It's possible, but is it realistic? And I'm you know, I'm not sure that was your remit, but I just find it, how are we going to do it? And also I just look at the cost at 260,000, if I read it right. Seems very. Was it 2 million? Or I'll be corrected there. Anyway, it's a lot of money, so I'll leave it there. It's just really, I just love to understand how you can get 630 cars down to 22 with some traffic lights and roads and things.
Yeah, but basically we're looking at adding an extra lane, an extra entry lane at each of the arms of the roundabout, and by doing that, you can significantly manage down what that queue will actually be in the peak hour. It's a simple relationship really between the entry capacity of each stop line and the circulatory traffic that's actually opposing that entry. And it's not untypical for one entry lane to have a capacity in the region of about 800 vehicles per hour in a typical scenario.
Well, one final thing then is this a roundabout at this moment in isolation, because all of those controlled moves and sending traffic in those volumes down to the next roundabout, and also through the narrowing and up some of these roads where it's 2 lanes suddenly goes to 1, I assume your modelling looks at the ability of the feeder, not feeder roads, but the uptake roads, I think the word is.
Yes, I mean we have also taken that into consideration. Yes, what you're basically saying is that quite often it's just the case you get to the next roundabout more quickly and the next delay more quickly. Yes, but we've actually looked downstream as well and looked at the impacts on the next roundabout.
Councillor Golding.
Very quick question. The first item on tranche 2 is described as M3 junction 7. Can I just check that there's M3 junction 7 and 8, which are effectively one junction where the traffic weaves between the A30 and the A303. The Highways Agency always considers it one, and I think in the last time we saw a list it had 7 and 8. Can we check that with Ian, who's the guy from our side, just in terms of what he's asked on that particular point? Because to my understanding it would be junction 7.
Only because if it is only junction 7, it won't really help, because the Highways Agency's concern is, and I've had to do several trips to Bournemouth because I had a relative who was ill in hospital, and I can tell you, even at normal times of day, getting on junction 7 and across onto the M3, across all the traffic coming off the M3 onto the A303 is a pretty difficult task as it is, and the Highways Agency were always very concerned about any increase in the traffic joining the M3 going south at junction 7 because of the impact on the traffic trying to leave at junction 8. So I do think you need to look at the two together. Lost the presentation. Councillor Cubitt.
Yes. Given that the projected increases in vehicle journeys on the Binfield roundabout is up to about 2,000 cars per hour, could you talk me through the Western Bypass analysis? Because obviously the current plan is for 3,000 houses to go on the western side, and yet the projected cars per hour is 200, and that doesn't really stack up with the numbers of houses that are being projected being built. So are you merely projecting cars that are coming off the M3 and you're forgetting to deal with the 3,000 houses de minimis, because there's eventually going to be 8,000 houses presumably built there? Or have you factored in these 3,000 houses and nobody's going to have cars?
No, in the diagrams that we've shown, we were showing the diversions from existing routes. So it's traffic that is existing and could potentially use those routes. So it's basically traffic travelling north-south, traffic travelling east-west. So there would, in effect, be, you know, some of the local traffic in that area as well, actually on that route. It's been excluded from the diagrams that we've actually shown, yes, because what we're trying to show is that existing traffic on existing routes will not use the new Western Bypass to any great extent, whereas the local traffic itself might well do.
Sorry, I have to say, therefore, whilst I find it interesting, I cannot understand, therefore, how you get to that bullet point, the penultimate bullet point. Because, of course, the rationale for the Western Bypass is not for current local traffic, and that's not what you've done with the rest of your hypotheses. The rest of your hypotheses and analysis and options is factoring in the new houses that are being built, which will result in additional car transport movements. So I don't understand why you would have applied a completely different logic to a road which is supposedly going to be supporting de minimis 3,000 houses and possibly more, and it will be part of a master plan.
Yeah, the reasoning for that is that most of the new housing in that area will not be travelling in the directions that the Western Bypass allows them to travel in. They will be travelling, for example, towards the centre of Basingstoke or further afield, rather than travelling westward, or rather than travelling along the Western Bypass. It's not actually on the routes of where people want to go from the new developments.
Can I just clarify that there will be traffic on the Western Bypass from local developments? What this diagram attempted to do was not to address that, but to address diversions from elsewhere in the network to that road. Because ultimately the point is you don't get very much relief in the centre of Basingstoke from the Western Bypass. Whether it has a function in terms of local distribution of traffic is another matter which we've not addressed.
Mr. Hunt?
All I was going to say, the reason for you look at what's diverting onto it is you're wanting to see whether it has a mitigation effect that means that you don't have to do something somewhere else. So what you're hoping is that link road would have shown a lot of diversion away from some of the junctions which are at capacity, which would mean you then don't have to do the improvements to those junctions, and you get the benefit from this. If you see what I mean?
But can I, unless I'm not being completely stupid, which is very, very probable, I understand the numbers that you're projecting are traffic that just happens inherently now, which might use that route. But we know that you've also identified sites within, like the 300-400, which you then demonstrate is going to have enormous increases in vehicle access as a result of the new housing. And all I'm saying is it's perverse for me, logically, to put forward this analysis and then make that major assumption without factoring in the fact that if you were to change the mitigation on the 300-400 roundabout and channel the new housing onto the Western Bypass, because that's why you would build a Western Bypass. You wouldn't build a Western Bypass and then allow everyone to go in on the 300-400. That would be illogical. Therefore, the projections, whilst interesting and part of the key to working out the benefits, is absolutely not sufficient information to make a leap to that penultimate bullet, in my opinion, but I'm probably being extremely unintelligent.
Yeah. The purpose of the bypass is as much for the longer distance traffic that wants to get around Basingstoke and to relieve the local roads within Basingstoke, rather than to provide an extra route for the local traffic.
Forgive me, but as consultants, that's an interesting response of yours, but actually we, the members, are trying to find out how it is best that we can preserve the quality of life for our current residents. Now, you might take that stance, but that have to beg to say is actually not what I would like to see in terms of the analysis that the Western Bypass is going to provide. Because if I were master planning a town for the betterment of the borough, I would be actively seeking to find out how much traffic you take off the 300-400 roundabout, which produces the horrendous statistics. And what you're effectively saying is the only people who will benefit from the Western Bypass are these 200 cars per hour, and that the remaining stats on that junction 300-400 remains unchanged, because everyone will still want, from the new housing that we're going to build, to go into the centre of Basingstoke.
There's a misconception here. We are not master planning Basingstoke. We are undertaking a sort of technical brief which says, you know, what if you had this road link here, what relief would that provide for junctions within Basingstoke? And the conclusion is very little. But your point is probably the next stage. Where do we go from here? How do we use the prospect of a Western Bypass in a creative sort of sense? That's not something for this study. It's something for the next stage of consideration.
But we haven't got all the... you've done...
Mrs. Kew, can it be a question to the consultants about this presentation, not extrapolate through to the future?
No, because it's very important, because if this is all that is going to be provided to us members in terms of analysis of how to mitigate congestion to the west, I just ask the consultants whether, would you be able to master plan on the basis of the information that you have given us, or would you think that there's an additional 85% of information that is needed to be given to us members in order to evaluate the number of vehicle relief that Western Bypass will produce? Is this the only work that we members are going to receive?
I think I can answer that, if I may. This is the very first cut of what the problems might be. When you come down to master planning, it's a totally different ballgame. One thing I did get educated on with people like Giorgio and Mr. Hunter is that master planning is the next level down. This is just giving us a first indication of where the problems might be. We just cannot discuss the levels of master planning because we don't have the data.
Consultant, to answer my question is, would you make a decision based on the information you've given us today?
No, we can't, because there isn't enough information available at the present time. But
Councillor Raphael.
Can I just say, first of all, can I thank the consultants for their detailed report? It's a very informative report. They've gone into a great deal of depth, and I have to say it was good to see that they have taken a number of scenarios which, even if we didn't build one house for the population of Basingstoke and Dean, the improvements that are suggested would improve those junctions from what they might be in 15 or so years' time. In relation to the Western Bypass, I would say from my part, I'm not content that the work that's been done so far is the final word on that subject. It's crystal clear that there's further information that needs to be put forward. To give to you just one example to perhaps assist Councillor Mrs. Cubitt, it would seem to me that a motorist travelling south on the A33 coming to the Ringway, knowing that there could be queuing for the traffic that wants to go north on the M3, may decide to go westwards and go down the Western Bypass. In the scenarios that you've modelled so far, that's not taken into consideration, probably because it's not something you've had a chance to think about yet. But it's not on your arrows with coming down the A33 and then going west. You've got the A340 and you've got other things. So there's probably more work to be done on that. And I think one of the things that we all know is that when a road is built, traffic flows onto it, perhaps disproportionately than perhaps those who are planning it had thought, because effectively people find the routes that suit them best. So there's probably further work to be done in due course. So I'm certainly not taking it the further word. I'm not content with that penultimate paragraph as being, but I accept that's where you've got to at this current moment.
Councillor, we're gearing up to the consultants, not the cabinet member. We've got a chance to talk to the portfolio holder when we discuss this in terms of sites. Councillor Leake.
Could I just ask why all the mitigation schemes appear to require signalised roundabouts or intersections, when if this was on the continent, we'd have endless underpasses? I mean, wherever I go on the continent, you go whizzing underground. I mean, even in Baden-Baden, you hit Baden-Baden, you go straight underneath it. Why do we always finish up with a signalised roundabout?
It's down to cost. If you're looking at underpasses, you're looking at significantly more expensive infrastructure.
I guess I knew that, but why is it they can do it and we can't? Because the traffic moves so much better on the continent than it does here.
Councillor Mr. Tucker, do you have any questions for the consultants? Councillor Sherlock? They've been asked, thank you. Councillor Peach?
Thank you. I'm just wondering, given, for example, if there's an incident on the M3, and I believe there was one on the 1st of July, which, although the closure was half an hour, it caused 2 hours of gridlock in the town centre. And these are obviously happening during peak hours on working days. And I think over the past 10 years there's been at least 18 full closures on the M3. So does your data include in the modelling exercise such closures and the impact that has?
No, because that's really an atypical scenario. I mean, like you say, it's been I think 18 closures over 10 years or so. It's just too infrequent to be able to model. It's not something that you can mitigate against. To actually mitigate against that would just be horrendously expensive.
Okay, I mean, I'll just caveat that. You know, when I say there were full closures, I mean, obviously the one recently wasn't a full closure, but nonetheless it still caused this huge impact. And if we have more cars on the road, etc., we could foresee that being an increasing risk. My other question is, in the introduction to the report, it was suggested that perhaps there's alternatives that people may choose, and it strikes me with Basingstoke being sort of a ring road model with as we go around, if you hit traffic, there's not often any alternative. So, what sort of options was you thinking in that comment?
As I said, that is your next stage of consideration. I mean, any urban area, you'll look at a range of solutions. You look at how to improve public transport, how to improve cycling, walking. You look at workplace travel planning, general travel planning. You might look at car parking, charging, and land use policies in respect to new development and office blocks and how much parking they should have, because they all come into the sort of mix of how you can manage the situation in Basingstoke going forward. One option at the extreme end is to cater for unremitting demand and provide underpasses and tunnels and that. But if that's not affordable, then you go down to some mix of provision and management that is that suits Basingstoke.
A very quick question as well on with regards to when you're looking at the study of the roads. Obviously, you're looking at numbers of vehicles and traffic flow. Now, this might be a bit of a not the best question in the world, but what I'm considering is there's also the types of traffic on roads. For example, the 339 sees frequently tractors and that type and slow-moving lorries and the impact that can have on traffic. Does that get taken into account?
I would say that tractors aren't taken into account unless there are a significant existing problem. What we would typically do, you base your information on the traffic count. That's the first thing, and that information you would actually go out there and physically count it, and you count the different vehicle types, so you know how this varies on different roads within your network. And then what you'd actually do, you would actually grow that up to a future scenario. So yes you do, but what we tend to look at the peak hours rather than the whole period throughout the day. And for example, tractors, you don't really get a great deal of tractor travel within the peak hours.
And there's the other question here. It's got the mitigation methods down. This is on page 35 of your presentation, which is joining the B3400 and the Roman Road coming down from the 339. It's number 27, and there's a mitigating measure there, but then immediately follows a single carriageway under a railway bridge. So is those sorts of things considered? Because you can mitigate a roundabout and that might smooth wonderfully, but then it stops immediately.
Yes, that has been taken into consideration. I think the way you should look at this is not to pay too much attention to the actual figures that have been shown at each junction. You know, we are looking at a scenario 16 years from now, and the actual figures, what will actually happen on the ground in 16 years, will be different to what's actually there at the moment. The way you should look at this is that from the best information we have available at the moment, what if as a worst case scenario we'll need mitigating in future, and for the sake of the local plan, can that be afforded? Is that sound? Because if yes, then all well and good. And when 15, 16 years comes, you may not need to provide all this, but you've covered for it anyway.
And so, essentially, in terms, although it's not a junction, we're not able to pick up specific, if you like, landmarks or features along the way that potentially could cause traffic problems with the increased traffic.
If you're talking about particular places on the network where there's narrowing of the carriageway, then yes, we've taken that into consideration. We would look at that and what the effective width is at that location, and how many equivalent lanes there are at that point on the network. Yes, we've just taken that into consideration.
Councillor Shaw.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Three things really. One is to really just support what Councillor Bierman said on the whole issue of modal shift. But in terms of questions, looking at the map on page 21, which shows the junctions within the sort of wider Basingstoke town area, there are, I think, a total of sort of 36 junctions identified on the map on the left-hand side, of which we've assessed the performance of 18. Have we undertaken any modelling at all on the other 18 junctions? And then I've got a sort of follow-up question.
The answer is not at the present time. We've spoken to the officers here, and we've agreed that these 18 will be looked at in the first instance. Whether any more junctions would be looked at after that is not the decision for us to make.
This question may need to be directed to the officers along with my final question. Question is that not a significant risk to not have undertaken modelling of these other junctions? Because does it not lay us open to a situation in which we later find that there are significant issues on junctions and they are not in the infrastructure delivery plan, they've not been modelled, we have no idea of cost implications? And my second question is on cross-border cooperation, and really sort of following on from Councillor Keith Watts earlier. And the question to the officers is what steps have we taken in terms of cross-border cooperation, or what steps will we be taking in terms of cross-border cooperation to ensure that either we or neighbouring local authorities are dealing effectively with the impact of out-of-borough development, and particularly its impact on traffic?
First question, in terms of the junctions, we prioritise those ones which have the most impact in terms of the local development plan scenarios. Some of those junctions are also already being looked at by Hampshire for other works that would take place well ahead of the local plan period. So that's on those points. In terms of the cross-border working, members will know that we've been involved in a number of core strategy examinations, for instance, at West Berkshire. We also are appearing next week at the Hart core strategy examination. We raised transport as a particular issue with them. They've come back and been able to satisfy us and Hampshire that the issues that they might have will not have the impacts or any major impacts on us. We meet with all of the local planning authorities in and around the borough to identify if there are particular issues. To date, in Test Valley, the majority of their development has been granted on appeal rather than through their local plan. So yes, we're very well engaged with those parties, and by the time we get to our examination, we will have to have a duty to cooperate statement, which sets out how we have worked together to overcome any cross-boundary issues that may exist. And if we haven't, then what measures we as a local authority have put in place to try and overcome those, or vice versa.
Just finally, and trying to sort of focus this down a little, two of the junctions that the consultants have looked at are the ones that are Junction 6, which is the Brighton Hill roundabout, and Junction 22, which is the Victory roundabout. In between those two junctions, there's the Winchester Road roundabout, which has not had any investigation undertaken of it. Is there not a risk that, if you improve, if you have problems with traffic flows at two junctions where there is a junction in the middle, is there not a risk or a potential problem with the and issues with the junction in the middle, and should that therefore not be investigated?
Thank you, Chair. Just to respond, Councillor, that particular junction is one of the ones that has been looked at by the County Council, and it's subject to a bid to the Local Transport Board for improvements. It's a bid that's been put forward by the County Council, one of 3 in the borough, and that's due for consideration in the next week or two, I think.
Councillor Keith Watts? No?
Nothing more to say, Chairman.
Gary Watts?
Just going on with the ruling out of the Western bypass, and just surely a part of the mitigation for forcing all the ever traffic coming down the B3 400 down to from Oakley to Basingstoke through the was it the Five Ways junction at Kempshot, and all the pressure it's going to have on all the other roundabouts in town and on the ring road. Surely mitigation for all the excess pressure that those roads are going to face is having a western bypass. So I totally agree with Councillor Cubitt. I mean, it seems illogical you're ruling it out at this stage. It's more of a statement than a question.
All we're saying is that from a very preliminary analysis, that it would appear that if you look at some of the other junctions within the western area and looked at mitigating the impact on those junctions, you could get a better mitigation than by building a western bypass. But that's very preliminary, looking at the preliminary figures of what could potentially transfer onto that. In order to rule it out, you'd have to do some more work.
To Basingstoke, when you have an opportunity to wheel out of Basingstoke the other way, and people are going to travel out from the new Manydown settlement through Oakley and through those dodgy country roads. Why not have a western bypass? Seems logical to me.
Just in terms of supporting the local plan has to mitigate its impacts. It has to be deliverable, it has to be cost effective. And it may be that through master planning of Manydown you may achieve some form of link road that when the finished development is there, that could link those two parts of the Manny site together, the likelihood in a local plan period is that you would need the bits that mitigate the actual plan. So the 3,000 houses to the north of the site would need to be mitigated. And it may be that your overriding plan is that you try to achieve a link road through the plan period and beyond, but it's the likelihood of a link road being there from day one and being from top to bottom is not something that would be required through the local plan and would make it undeliverable. So you'd have to consider how you would want to deliver that as a local authority outwith of the local plan, if you like. So you can get the first part in, and you could safeguard land in the future, but you would have to plan for it in that kind of way. It would also depend upon whether you wanted to have a road that went, round the edge of Basingstoke, which basically sent everyone to Newbury, or whether you wanted that to be part of the development.
Understand it's more of a longer term plan instead of, can't justify it with just 3,000 homes. Yeah.
Bearing in mind the timing, Councillor Mr. James.
Thank you. My first question is,
And standing orders, members. Okay.
you talked earlier in the beginning of your presentation about a self-limiter. So we've got mitigation. Is self-limiter rat running? What is self-limiter? What do you mean by self-limiter?
Yes. What I meant was that congestion itself tends to limit growth in traffic. In a certain period, you can only get so much traffic through the network, and people generally don't want to put up with the very extensive delays. So what's happened over the years in large cities like London, you've got congestion which used to be between 8 and 9, now going between 7 and 10. So you've got a spreading of the pressure over time. You get people wanting to, either deciding that they would have made the journey but they're put off because of the level of congestion. So you get an effect which actually says this congestion starts to affect decisions that people have, businesses have, and that limits the growth that actually occurs on the ground.
How would self-limiting impact on an economic strategy of the borough?
I mean, in terms of what you're talking about, is the spreading of journeys might have no impact on an economic strategy. We all work much more flexibly than we did in the past. We all work from home in those sort of circumstances. So if your economic your economic strategy was to build the borough and make it more economical, you would enable that by spreading that traffic over different periods of the times of the day. We all work much more flexibly now, so that would enable you to do that.
My other question is, how do you count, just remind, traffic is the first part of the question, and when you count it, so you're counting it at a roundabout or a junction, do you then know where it's come from? Have you got the ability to identify where that traffic came from, where it started its journey?
Well, there are different ways of counting traffic. You can count traffic across a network, across an area, and look at the origins and destinations across that area. You could do that, for example, by looking at registration number plate surveys at different locations around the town, and then you would be able to recognise registration cars actually going from one location to another. But generally, most counts are either done manually, so you'll see someone standing on a street corner actually counting traffic going past and the different vehicle types, or you'll have automatic traffic counters put down, such as loops on the road. And there you'd count the number of axles, so you'd be able to work out the number of cars and the number of heavy vehicles actually passing a point.
How robust is the counting at a junction, a manual count?
Well, a manual count will be pretty robust on the day that you actually go out and can count the traffic. as long as you've got sufficient people there in order to count the traffic. So at a busy location, you would need more people than at a quiet location, for example. But you would get day-to-day variation in traffic flows, just because the flow past a particular point on a particular day, at a particular time, will not be the same on each day within the week, for example, or within different months. So you will get some sort of daily, weekly, monthly variations.
And what you've presented tonight on the work, because not all of it has been assessed, what is the total requirement to mitigate in monetary terms? I work it out to be about, it's over 30 million, is that right?
Yeah. Okay, just to go back to what we were saying earlier, I mean, this is a worst case scenario. What will happen if there is unconstrained growth across the network? So it's basically, if everybody wanted to travel in the peak hour, and this is the traffic growth that we're actually looking at, then if we said yes, we will develop the network all over the place so that you can actually do that. This is what we'd be looking at in terms of the cost. But as we said, we haven't looked at other options such as public transport transfer or the flexibility of being able to work at different times. So these traffic flows themselves might not actually materialise in future. So it's really sort of the worst case.
Councillor Shaw raised the concern about Winchester Road. Didn't you in the presentation say that you would have to put another lane into Winchester Road? Wasn't that part of the mitigation?
I think Councillor Shaw's question was about Winchester Road roundabout, whereas the consultants were talking about Winchester Road further to the southwest towards Hatchwarren.
And in the earlier presentation, we talked about SIL, that we're going to see in relation to what's been recommended, a smaller percentage of affordable housing to be enabling us to deliver what we need for SIL. So we're going to see sites come forward that people don't want. An example, Kennel Farm, say, that won't be, but there will be urban sites that come forward with lesser affordable housing to deliver the infrastructure that we need to mitigate. It just, if you square the circle, it just doesn't. We're having to deliver less affordable to get the money that we need to mitigate for the problem of the development, and we're not actually meeting the housing need of the borough. Is that? Am I getting
This
it
was
wrong?
a transport study, Councillor Mrs. James. Yeah, I understand your point completely. Yes, and you can square it, but it really isn't. If I may mention this, Mr. Hunt, it's not the subject of this particular study and presentation that we've got here at the moment.
The final question then is, in China, as part of the mitigation, they put number plates, and if you've got a certain letter on your number plate, you're not allowed out that day. Have we considered that? What do you think?
They have a similar situation in place in Athens, whereby you can go into the centre of Athens on a certain day. The way people get around that is, but they have two cars with different number plates.
It happens, in fact, all over Europe. It happened in Belgium when I lived there. So, yes, it's not a new idea. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair.
And you're the last one. And
I'm not going to repeat what anyone else has said, really. I agree with most of it and the points that have been raised about the questions that need to be answered are there. The extra bit I'd like to add is, having sat through a presentation recently on another analysis to do with another part of Basingstoke, that analysis used a very different methodology to the one you've done. And I understand that there's different methodologies you can apply. But the analysis gave us direction, origin, speed, it gave us the volume, it gave us an analysis that, in my opinion, gave me more assurance of what was being proposed in that particular meeting than what I'm seeing here, because I appreciate you've not had a lot of time to do it, I appreciate that. But I'm worried, and I'm still not satisfied, that what you've said will stand up to an EIP scrutiny. because of the bits that you've not been able to do, the bits that other councils have identified, to be fair, we need to add in, the bits that other people are doing, for example, the county council, and we don't know that the county council's analysis is, I mean, I guess it would be, but I mean, would that stand up to EIP? I'm sure it would do, but I don't know it would do. So in accepting all of this, I guess there's an awful lot of holes that at the moment I don't see filled. And I'm not necessarily sure how you can fill them in the time we've got available to make site selection, and therein actually adopt anything at 90 mile an hour in a few weeks' time. So for me, the analysis that you could do for us running up to EIP, is it conceivable that you could fill those gaps in? And if needs be, and it shows, particularly this is a question for Andrew, if we wind up in that situation when we suddenly have, oh, there's a red light here because another piece of work has been done on a junction rather than a roundabout, as Councillor Shaw rightly, where does that then leave us? Because, you know, we're taking this, with all due respect to the consultants, as far as they've gone, but not as far as perhaps many of us would like it to go to be satisfied with the process.
2 points. I don't know which presentation you were at. I assume it was to do with the planning application. So it's related to a development proposal rather than a strategic modelling of a whole borough. So there's some difference.
I am being careful in what I'm saying. It was related to a strategic analysis, and it actually affected most of the town.
Second point, in terms of taking this to EIP, this level of presentation, this level of information is perhaps somewhat further than most local authorities would go for EIP in terms of the junction mitigations and the costings. This is also fulfills the guidance which the HA are looking for us to meet in terms of us getting them on side in terms of an examination. The level of detail that you are talking about is much more akin to master planning and planning applications rather than a strategic borough-wide assessment to ensure that the developments can go forward and that development could work, and then that the details get picked up through the planning process.
Okay. Thank you, members. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your presentation. Lot of things to think about in that, obviously from the questions that came around the table. We look forward to the final presentation of the assessment in due course. You couldn't give us a closer timescale than that. Andrew? Okay, it's within the next couple of weeks, members, for your information. Before we leave the table and close the meeting, I'd just like to remind members of tomorrow night, just to remind you what we're covering. Officers are going to present the affordable housing policy. There'll be questions around the table again, time limited, and then we're going to follow that up by the infrastructure delivery plan. See you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Meeting closed.